Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the City Council work session of Tuesday, July 15th. Call the meeting to order and ask for approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Next, we will have public comment. And I do want to let everyone know that you will get a chance to ask questions from the audience after each presentation. But is there anyone that has public comment not related to this meeting? Okay, great, thank you. Anybody on Zoom? All right. So the first thing we're gonna do before we start the discussion items is do a roll call for the different committees. So if you are on the planning commission, would you please stand? Yeah, or raise your hand on Zoom. This is for attendance purposes only. And so we're going back in the classroom. Yes. You want to come home? Okay, so we've got Mike Bates and Nikki from the planning commission. On Zoom, we have Clay and
Les Sinclair.
Les Sinclair. Okay, if you're on the design review board, would you please stand or raise your hand? Oh, instructions from there. Okay, so design review, we have Tim, we have Valerie. Right. And Anita's on Zoom.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, on public works? Anybody? Parks and community services?
Yes, Andrea Kelly is on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Andrea Kelly for public works. Parks and community services, we have Anita and Les. And anyone else?
Janae.
Janae's public works.
She's actually, I think she's. Yeah, she's on the.
Okay. Budget committee, other than the 5 of us, is there anyone? 10? Okay. Anyone else on Zoom?
Not seeing any hands up.
Farmers market committee? They're tired with market day. And then tourism and arts. Okay. So first off, I would like to thank the Friends of the Dunes, and especially Diana for organizing this event. I want to make sure everyone knows I was not in charge of the weather. Just saying. And so the first thing that we will do is have a presentation by Meg Reed, and she's on Zoom.
Hello all, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
I'll share my screen. All right, how does that look?
Yeah, just fine. Thank you.
Great, thanks all. Thank you for having me. So I'm Meg Reed. I'm the Coastal Policy Specialist for the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I'm going to give a presentation mostly focused on statewide planning goal 18, beaches and dunes, as it relates to generally shoreline stabilization and some other factors that occur in this very dynamic environment, and kind of talk about some new things that have been coming up. So I'll just start a little bit to give some context of who we are as an agency and program. The Department of Land Conservation and Development is the state's land use planning agency, and we help oversee the administration of the state planning program. But we also host the Oregon Coastal Management Program, which is a federal state partnership that was established through the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972. And Oregon was the second state in the country to become a federally approved coastal management program in 1977. And our program is somewhat unique in the country in how we're structured. We're a watershed-based networked program. So this map here on the right is the coastal management zone for Oregon, which is roughly the crest of the Coast Range out to the edge of the territorial sea, which is 3 nautical miles from shore. And that roughly it matches the watersheds of the coast. So it's a pretty broad program. As a comparison, the state of California is about 1,000 feet from the shoreline. So a much narrower coastal zone compared to Oregon's. That means that every county and city and state agency that has authority in that coastal zone is part of our networked program, the Oregon Coastal Management Program. And so that means all of you at the City of Cannon Beach are part of this program. And we take the comprehensive plans and implementing zoning ordinances of all of these cities and counties, and we have them as part of our coastal management program, which we can apply during federal actions that are proposed in the coastal zone, like proposals that are federal agencies are undertaking themselves, or that are being proposed for a federal permit. So for example, dredging or the maintenance of jetties or things like that. And then really what our work focuses on for the coastal management program is the implementation of the last 4 of the 19 statewide planning goals, which are listed here. And they're really about the coastal resources in these areas. So goal 16 is for estuarine resources, goal 17 is for coastal shorelands, goal 18, beaches and dunes, and goal 19, ocean resources. Goal 19 is the only statewide planning goal that is solely implemented by the state. So local cities and counties don't have a role in Goal 19, but you certainly have a very large role in all of the others. And you have all 3 present in the city of Cannon Beach. But I just wanted to share this graphic, which is not the best graphic in the world, but it is to help kind of visualize that these coastal planning goals are very spatial in their implementation. So the estuary goal 16 is really the waters of the estuaries. It's zoning in the water, just like there's zoning on land, and that's very unique to Oregon. No other water bodies and no other states implement zoning in the estuaries like we do, but that's a pretty unique feature. Goal 17 is the lands adjacent to estuaries as well as coastal lakes and the ocean shore. And then goal 18 is the sandy areas on the outer coast, so the beaches and dunes. And then, as I mentioned before, the ocean resources, which is the state's territorial sea, which is from extreme low water out to 3 nautical miles. But I'll focus really just mainly on goal 18 for this presentation. This goal is really about the geomorphology of these environments and whether or not they're appropriate for development. It's really guiding those kinds of developments. So the first main feature of the goal and what it requires of local governments is an inventory of beach and dune landforms. So for example, this map, it's probably really hard to see, but it says like inland for dune, stabilized for dune, younger stabilized dunes, older stabilized dune, wet deflation plain, things like that. So that's kind of part 1 of this goal, is to inventory these areas. Then there is a few main implementation requirements, and I'll just kind of touch on the most common ones that come up. One is that there is a prohibition for residential, commercial, and industrial development on the most unstable of those landforms, and those are listed in the goal. So it's mostly like, for example, the beach and active foredunes and wet deflation plains would be inappropriate places for residences, commercial and industrial structures. So those areas prohibit development. However, other types of development would be allowable as long as it takes those kind of dynamic forces into account and they're of minimal value. So like boardwalks or beach access points or beachfront protective structures, which we'll talk more about. There's also a requirement around the preservation of dune vegetation. There's extensive requirements around dune grading, which is generally lowering of the dunes for views. And then beachfront protective structures, which generally refer to structural types of erosion control techniques like riprap, seawalls, and bulkheads. So I'll focus really on that one in particular and talk about its details. Really, when this goal was first implemented in the 1970s, the aim was to limit shoreline armoring. So those types of structures like riprap and seawalls and things like that. There was, however, put in a grandfathering clause, really to avoid takings claims at that time. So in the definition it says that beachfront protective structures can only be allowed where development existed on January 1st, 1977. And in this case, development is defined as houses, commercial and industrial buildings, and vacant but improved subdivision lots, meaning that it was a platted subdivision which had roads and utilities to it. We have an inventory, which I'll talk a little bit about. It's unofficial, but we did do an inventory of the entire coast of lot by lot, whether they were eligible or ineligible according to this development date. And so it still allows for that kind of structural shoreline erosion mitigation, but really is limited to just those areas that already had development existing at that time, basically. The reason for that is that there is a lot of things that happen to the beach with shoreline armoring that are negative, meaning that over time, it can limit the width of the beach because it's trapping sediment and it alters the landscape and can sometimes be aesthetically unappealing. And there are just a lot of different cons. There are some pros as well, as it's protective of the private property that it is in front of. When it comes to this provision, this is just a front door policy, really. There are many other pieces to the permitting process for any one of these structures, whether it's an actual structure or something that's more non-structural, like a cobble revetment or vegetated burrito or something like that. The local permitting process is part of that, and then usually there's a component that's permitted by the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, who has jurisdiction over the public beach areas. This graphic, I think, is helpful to kind of get to those points that I was talking about why shoreline armoring can be detrimental for public access to the beach and the beach's health over time, where you have naturally eroding bluffs that add to the sediment and can continue to build the beach. But if you prevent that, then the beach gets narrower, especially with sea level rise, and it can really actually limit beach access, which we have seen in some parts of Oregon where people are not able to access the beach, especially during high tides, because of the riprap that's present. But I also wanted to point out that there is another piece of this that's from Statewide Planning Goal 17, coastal shorelands, and there is a requirement in there that says land use management practices and non-structural solutions to problems of erosion and flooding shall be preferred to structural solutions. So it's an important one to note that this is also in Goal 17. This is a viewer that I was mentioning before. It's publicly available on the Coastal Atlas, which is something that our agency supports. It's called the Ocean Shores Online Viewer, and you can see this inventory as well as where there are beachfront protective structures already, and FEMA flood maps, erosion hazards from Dogami, tsunami inundation zones, and other sorts of administrative boundaries all in one place. I will just mention that this is not a replacement for local eligibility determination. So the local government is in charge of making that determination of whether or not a parcel is eligible for a beachfront protective structure based on that development date and the definition of development. So here are some statistics about shoreline armoring on the Oregon coast. These are a little bit outdated numbers, but they're still pretty accurate. So about 22.7 miles of the coastline are already armored. That's about 6% of the overall coastline, which is pretty low, especially compared to a lot of other coastal states. Most of that armoring is located in Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties, which is not surprising because that's where most people live on the coast. The South Coast also experiences a lot of erosion, but there's just a lot less development. So that's really why there isn't as much. 84% of the coast is not eligible for armoring under the current policy. So again, a pretty large chunk. But the eligible and unarmored lots still account for a good chunk, about 42 miles of coast. There have been some studies over the years by various academic professionals. Some of Peter Ruggiero's colleagues, Steve Dundas is an economist at OSU who has done some studies that looked at the Goal 18 policy and shoreline armoring and had found that without the policy, we would have about 69% more armoring over the next 40 years. And if you added sea level rise into that, it would increase an additional 5.4%. So it's certainly with the intention which the state had in the 1970s, which was to limit armoring. I think it's meeting that intended policy. This photo on the bottom is something I like to share because it really kind of shares the impact of Goal 18 policies, not just shoreline armoring, but the other parts like where development is prohibited. So that area that's pointed at from the red arrow is development that occurred prior to 1977, before Goal 18 was in place. And then the area to the north, that's behind a vegetated dune, is post 1977 development. And you can see that that's really impactful in the way that they're experiencing sand inundation right now. Those homes are built on the foredune, and so they're completely inundated with sand. And then on years where that's not so much the case, they're right on the edge of the beach. The other development is behind a dune that provides protection from erosion and flooding, and they don't have the same problems with sand inundation. So you have a very wave energetic climate, as I'm sure you'll hear more about and experience in your day-to-day lives. So what are the options for those who are not eligible? There are some different options, and that we're learning more about them all the time. So the first kind of option is to move the structure back on the property, or to have really strong setbacks in the first place so that the development is built in an area that's safe. There's vegetative stabilization, so plants and trees can provide a lot of structural integrity in the dune system and help with providing protection from erosion and flooding. And I know there's some good examples, and I think I might have a photo later on from Cannon Beach where there's been willow plantings on the beach slope that have been pretty successful. There can be enhancement of the beach or the dunes, and then dynamic revetments, which is what's pictured here. And that's where there's loose cobble that is put on the beach at the toe of the dune that can move with wave energy, but helps to dissipate that wave energy. This one is at Cape Lookout State Park, and it's been protecting the campground there for a number of years. The key pieces for us from a policy perspective are that non-structural solutions cannot reflect wave energy, and they can't include structural elements, and they should be using biodegradable materials, things that can move with the wave energy, generally speaking. I wanted to highlight that there was recently passed this legislative session, Senate Bill 504, and this is a piece of legislation that directs the Department of Land Conservation and Development to do rulemaking to provide guidance and a definition for non-structural nature-based solutions for shoreline stabilization. And this would be something that would occur across coastal landscapes from estuaries, coastal shorelands, and the ocean shore. And prioritize these over traditional structural methods. We'll be starting that in the next coming year, and we'll have a rulemaking advisory committee to help guide that effort. This screenshot that I have on the top is something that I wanted to highlight, as if you don't know of this resource already, Oregon Sea Grant has this Oregon Coastal Hazards Ready Library and Mapper, which has a lot of really great information about hazards on the Oregon coast, as well as case studies. And they do have a whole section on erosion case studies and what different people or locations have utilized for erosion control. So it's a really good resource to see what other people are doing across the coast. And like I've mentioned before, eligibility, whether you meet that development date or not, is just kind of a first step in the process. The Oregon Parks and Recreation Department is the steward of the ocean shore. They have jurisdiction over anything that's occurring in that area. And their authorities are from different places. So statewide planning goal 18 is one piece of policy. There's also the beach bill, which is what provides that recreational easement over the beach. And that's also the removal fill law. Generally, you might be familiar with removal fill in like wetland areas, which is something that's implemented by the Department of State Lands. In 1999, the authority of removal fill on the ocean shore was given to the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. And so they are the ones who are implementing that policy now on the Oregon shore, on the ocean shore. And so I just wanted to highlight that Goal 18 is one piece, but it's not the only piece. There are lots of other criteria that need to be met when there is an application for a shoreline stabilization technique. There's also any alteration to the ocean shore needs a permit. So that could also include beach access ways, dune grading, pipelines and cables, and natural product removal. These permits always have a land use compatibility statement on them where it is brought to the local government for sign off to say whether or not that project complies with the comprehensive plan and land use ordinances. So I'll just briefly mention the other main piece of Goal 18 that I'm sure you all are very familiar with around grading for views. So Goal 18 does require that view grading can only happen when it's under a four-dune management plan, but remedial grading can happen even without a four-dune management plan. And remedial grading is really like maintenance for the structure, like the house. So you can see in these photos, it's a pretty clear difference between the top, which is view grading, so lowering the dune down, versus the bottom, which is sand that's physically piled up against the house, and they need to grade around the house to be able to enter the house. So that's remedial grading versus view grading. The four-dune management plan, like I said, it is a requirement for any type of view grading. It is optional, so you do not have to allow it. Cannon Beach does not. In 2020, the city passed that view grading would no longer be allowed. The city of Manzanita currently has a moratorium on view grading, and there's only 6 four-dune management plans in total on the Oregon coast, and they're all on the north or central coast. We have been helping local jurisdictions update parts of their Goal 18 policies or code in their comprehensive plan. There's good reason for doing that. These are really dynamic areas. We know a lot more about them now than we did in the 70s. There's seasonal erosion and sea level rise and things like that. And we have recently put out a new maps in GIS data for that inventory I mentioned before about like where is there open sand, conditionally stable four dunes, wet deflation plains, things like that. And we have new maps now for all of Clatsop County. So those are available and able to be adopted by any local jurisdiction to update their inventory and how they then implement Goal 18 policies. We also have several resources that I just wanted to go through. So one is the guidebook on erosion control practices of the Oregon coast. We put that together back in 2021, and it kind of goes through all the typical erosion control structures that we see on the Oregon coast and their various permitting requirements. We have a sea level rise planning guide for coastal Oregon that's really for local governments to think about how to incorporate sea level rise planning into their day-to-day planning. We have a tsunami land use guide that has model code in it. And we have a coastal public access guide about accessing the ocean shore and how to improve those access programs. That was just put out very recently in 2024. And then we have a few things that are coming soon. So we'll have a beaches and dunes land use guide, which will have model code in it for updating, not only for Goal 18 policies, but also for public access and coastal hazards. So Goal 7 is for all natural hazards. We also will have a Oregon Coastal Dune Management Guidebook, which again is really for view grading, but there will be some really good background information in it. And that's coming from a student at Oregon State University. And Oregon Sea Grant is working on a planting guide for erosion control that will be, I think, really helpful for homeowners and local government staff. And then our agency has to do a 5-year assessment and strategy every year. And part of our next one is coming out, and it will start next July. And we have a strategy around coastal hazards and resilience that's really geared towards assisting local governments. So if it's of interest, let us know. So I'll happy to take questions or wait until all the presentations are over. But thank you very much for your time.
So does anyone have a question now for the speaker? Mike?
If you can hear me, I get from your presentation that armoring, coastal hardening is not a preferred solution unless it's necessary. And I just wonder how DCLD goes about determining when that is necessary when you have that question before you.
Well, it's really not our job to do that because we're not actually issuing any permits. So it would be the local government or the Parks and Recreation Department, or if it's in the estuary, the Department of State Lands. So we don't issue permits, but we're just helping local governments be in compliance with the land use planning policies and goals. So that determination is not something that we make. So it's really up to the local government and their criteria in the code, and then OPRDs as well, of like what constitutes the decision for when that is approved or not.
Can this reduction of the sandy beach due to armoring, can it happen in a rapid fashion, that such as a huge storm, as well as gradually?
Yes, that sand loss can happen both gradually or in a huge storm. And I'm sure Peter will talk more about that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still thought to be true, but some years ago, there was the theory that all the sand in the littoral cell kind of lived in that cell always and sloshed around, moved around with storms and weather and so on, but didn't typically leave the cell. What's the current thinking on that?
Yeah, I believe that's still true, and I'm sure Peter could talk more about this than I can, but generally sand stays between headlands, and it like kind of goes away in the winter and comes back on in the summer, depending on like the prevailing winds and the ocean currents. But when you have the shoreline armoring in place, then it's trapping that sediment, so that sediment can no longer be contributing to that littoral cell. And so sometimes you can then get an imbalance where you're not getting as much sand in the system. Because in our case, we're not necessarily getting a lot of riverine sediment. It's a lot of the sediment is coming from the sandy beaches to replenish the sandy beaches.
Lisa?
Yeah, can you tell me when you're gonna have that beaches and dunes guide out, the land use guide? Do you know when that will be published or available to the public?
I think probably, I would say probably within the next 6 months would be my guess. It's part of a project that we have funding for right now, and it's a deliverable of that project. And I think the project ends the end of September. My colleague Rhiannon, who is usually the one who talks to y'all about Goal 18, was traveling tonight, but she is leading that effort. And if you wanted to follow up with us, you're welcome to do that. We also we share the model code already. Like we've been sharing it with many jurisdictions. And as an example, Tillamook County has adopted it in their comprehensive plan and zoning ordinances. So if you wanted to look at what the kinds of things we're putting out there are, that would be a good place to look, is Tillamook County.
You mentioned something about, we hear the term all the time, nature-based solutions, yet everyone's definition of what nature-based solution is different. You mentioned something about doing some work on it. We hear about it all the time. It's brought up in all of our meetings, yet it means something different to each individual. So we have no definitions in our ordinance that discuss nature-based solutions. We have vegetative, we have structural or non-structural, that's what we have. So we have all this comment and concern of nature-based, but it's nowhere in our code, so I guess I would look for some input from you if you have anything at all, if you have any just general structural versus non-structural versus nature-based solutions.
Yeah, I think because of our policy system that we have through the statewide planning goals, it really is structural versus non-structural. Like that's the way the policies are set up. So without a major change to those policies, like that's going to continue to be the case. You can still talk about nature-based solutions within that framework, and you're welcome to create a definition for the city that works for the city. But as you saw, we have this bill now that's directing us to create a definition of what a non-structural nature-based solution is. And we worked with the bill sponsors to make sure that we could do this rulemaking in the context of our existing land use system and the planning goals. So I think it will be really something that can fit within that structural versus non-structural kind of concept, but also thinking about nature-based solutions. So I think generally nature-based solutions are going to be in the non-structural category. It's just going to be like, what do they look like?
Other questions in the audience? Is there anyone on Zoom that would like to ask a question of this speaker?
Yeah, I got 3.
Okay,
First one is Will Rasmussen.
good evening, Will.
Are you there, Will?
Can you hear me all right? You guys there?
Yep.
Loud and clear.
Great, thank you. Hi, Meg, Will Rasmussen, Miller Nash. Good to see you. Thank you for taking time out of your evening to join this conversation. I am a land use lawyer and have run permits for shoreline applications in Cannon Beach and other jurisdictions and with OPRD. And it's just generally a difficult process. You talked about the high energy climate that we have in our wave systems in Oregon. And I know one of the goals in Goal 18 is protect property from natural hazards. And then there's this kind of newfound push we're seeing from the regulating agencies and from Friends of the Dunes to favor non-structural solutions. My question is simple. The regulatory regime and particularly Goal 18, which I understand is your gambit, your role here is talking about Goal 18, has allowed structural solutions and does still allow structural solutions when the non-structural solutions won't work. Is that still your understanding of the goal and the rules that DLCD is responsible for, that where applicants show that non-structural solutions won't work, that Goal 18 allows riprap and other structural solutions?
Well, I think it's, like I said before, that Goal 18 is one piece of the overall permitting process. So
yeah, and that's all I'm
really
asking
just
you
like,
about.
it's a
I know
yes or
that's
no. Are you
Yeah.
developed as of 1977 or not?
Yes.
I do think, though, there's also still that Goal 17 that's shall be preferred to structural solutions. I think our knowledge of the system has changed since the beginning of the policy was developed. And so I think that there is a greater understanding of the challenges of having structural. But again, it's really the whether that becomes approved or not is really then based on the other criteria, which is the removal fill law, the beach bill, and the local permitting criteria. So Goal 18 is not really, that's not the thing that's saying yes or no. It's just saying that you can't even apply if you were developed after this fact. But if you were, then you can apply. It's not really saying whether or not you can or can't. It's just a front door.
Yeah. So, but under Goal 18, you can't have riprap in the right circumstances, it sounds like. Just for
If
Goal
you meet
18
the other
purposes.
criteria.
Yeah, just for Goal 18 purposes. Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, next,
We've got Cameron.
Cameron,
Hi, can you hear me?
yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Cameron LaFollette here, Oregon Coast Alliance. I believe I recall reading in the guide to, I forget its exact title, one of the guides you showed on different solution opportunities for beachfront protection, is that cobble berms tend to work less well on individual properties rather than larger areas like the front of Cape Lookout State Park. So maybe you're not the right person to ask about this, but I wanted to get more information and detail on why that is, or whether there's experience and knowledge about how to form or shape or configure a cobble berm that would make it more workable, perhaps in combination with something else, in front of individual properties. And if you're the wrong person to ask that question of, my apologies, I'll save the question.
No worries, thanks for the question. I mean, there probably are others who can chime in on this, but I would say that generally, like if it's like a 50-foot lot on the ocean front, that it's not as effective to put cobble on just that place because it's generally going to move over time. And so having a longer stretch, like if multiple property owners wanted to go in on an application together, they could do a cobble berm in front of more than one house. If it was like a hotel or, you know, a campground or something that had like more frontage, then maybe it would be appropriate. But like a single family lot is just generally not a long enough to put enough volume of cobble, and it would be probably, you would need to have maintenance very frequently. Not to say that you couldn't do it, it's possible. I just don't think we have a lot of examples of that for an individual oceanfront property.
So how then, with respect to an individual lot where desire for shoreline armoring often comes up, what good options can there be that are the non-structural seawall or riprap? Or
Yeah, I think it's
non-structural
challenging.
rather than seawall or riprap.
Yeah, I think, you know, there is also, like I said before, vegetation, like willow plantings has been effective in some places, moving the structure back or relocating, and also like dune augmentation, or beach nourishment. I know that one area on Lincoln County has done beach where they just like push sand from lower onto the beach up in front of the property to create like a small dune. Over time, it certainly is something that need to be maintained, but that is an option.
Okay, thank you.
And then next,
We have Anita.
Anita, go ahead.
Hello, Anita Duber, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Parks and Community Service Committee. And we are beginning the process of reviewing the Parks and Trails Master Plan for Cannon Beach. And looking at our beach access, we have 46 beach access points in Cannon Beach. And I'm just wondering if you could help in this discussion on what we might look for to discuss with these beach access areas in town.
Or like purposes of keeping them open, or like,
Yeah, I mean, just looking at our master plan, you know, some of the development, you know, plazas, whether there should be benches, trash receptacles, and just how much development really is necessary. And I guess just as a point of conversation, for me, it would be nice to know what the state might be recommending or looking for in that regard.
yeah, I would be happy to help with that, and we can utilize the guide that we just put out, which has a lot of great resources in it.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, anyone else on Zoom? Any follow-up in the audience? Questions? Here.
What kind of negative effects can this armoring riprap or seawall have on adjacent properties?
I think probably Peter should answer that one more than me, but my understanding is that there can be some edge effects. So like sometimes there can be like localized scouring on the edges of a riprap or a seawall if the other property is not armored too. But that's probably the extent of my knowledge for that.
Lisa?
There was a question as to whether Goal 18 forbids riprap or structural solutions. And, please tell me if I got your answer correctly. I think you said in reality, Goal 18 doesn't forbid or permit structural solutions because that isn't the job of Goal 18. That they do neither at this point. They don't say okay or never, either one. Is that correct?
Yes, generally I would agree with that. I think overall the policy to me says that like no armoring, but you're allowed to have it if you were developed as of this date. And if you were developed as of this date, then your structure must like, there's like three things. I think the goal says like minimize erosion, minimize impacts to neighboring properties, and protects public access and things like that. Those then get implemented through the local permitting process and as well as through the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, which includes a whole host of other criteria because they have other types of authorities and priorities from their side of things that are separate and different from what Goal 18 requires. So it's a little bit of both, I would say. Like it's overarching, the policy says no armoring, except if you were developed as of this date.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Remember, you'll have a chance later also. Okay, thank you very much. Number 2, we have Jessica. Post engineering.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me today. So I'm Jessica Cote. I am a coastal engineer. I have a master's in coastal and ocean engineering from Oregon State University. I've been practicing for 25 years. The first 6, 7 years was actually on the East Coast of the United States, so I have a little bit of benefit from working on both coasts. But now I practice mostly in Washington. We do a little bit of work in Oregon, and I, of course, spent a long time on the Oregon coast when I was in graduate school. So I'm going to talk about all of these things that you're asking about, but how we handle them in Washington State, just as a comparison, and mostly in Puget Sound with the Salish Sea, because our regulations are a little more advanced there than they are on the outer coast. We've done some work on the outer coast, so I also will certainly talk about that as well. And I'm going to try to address a number of these questions that came up as well and bring a little bit more context to that. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about Washington shoreline regulation, offshore nature-based solutions. I'm going to say right away that term is still trying to be defined by the greater coastal engineering community. There is a university, not university, but British Columbia, Canada manual on nature-based solutions, which is pretty good, that's out. I think the real trick in defining that term is that it's so specific to any given particular geomorphology, so particular beach that you're working on. And so even like the Army Corps of Engineers, who's really, they develop the guidance that coastal engineers sort of live and die by. Their guidance is called Engineering with Nature, and it's very focused on the East Coast of the United States. So we're really, as a profession, still trying to get our arms around this and bring together that information in a more centralized way. OSU is doing a great job of trying to build a lot of these topics into their curriculum and research. But I'll talk a little bit about dynamic coastal structures, hard armor applications, and hybrid solutions. And then before, I also just want to mention, so Meg used the term beachfront protective structure. So this is another challenge with our profession because it's smaller and, than other professions. In Puget Sound, they call them bulkheads. They're really seawalls, like, again, we look to the Army Corps of Engineers, who's the Bible that we as coastal engineers sort of have to live and die by. They're seawalls or they're riprap revetments, like those are the technical terms, but there's a lot of other language. Burritos, your vegetative burritos, like not a, when I first got the call they were like, you're a vegetative burrito, I'm like, no idea what that is. Well, sure enough, it's very similar to other solutions, it's just has a different name. So a lot of these sort of colloquialisms that have been built over time. We have similar issues in Washington State as Meg was talking about. So why have the regulations have changed, I would say, a lot over my career. I've been in Puget Sound for 19 years. And when I first started, it really wasn't that hard to get a permit to put in a bulkhead or to modify a bulkhead or to change a structure. That's changed drastically, particularly over the last 10 years. And a lot of the reasons for that is because of a lot of studies that came into play, recognizing that 29% of the Puget Sound shoreline was armored, and that there were a lot of negative impacts both to sediment supply as well as to habitat. So that's kind of why the regulations came to be. I'm an engineer, so I'm gonna really talk about regulations in terms of like how they impact what we do and how it influences the kinds of solutions that we can implement. So hard armor does protect structures. I mean, that's why it was put in place. But it also accelerates the erosion of the beaches. So I like to say that engineers do the best that they could with the information they had available at the time. A little bit of a defense of, I guess, my profession. But so all of these structures were put in Puget Sound, and it was a domino effect. Somebody asked about end effects. You put in one, you're gonna get erosion on the adjacent land where there is no structure. It's just a reality of a hard surface next to a soft surface. You get this eddy circulation pattern essentially. And so once one structure goes in, they just tend to basically fill the littoral cell because they do have this end effect on them. There's been a lot of documentation showing that they do accelerate erosion. And so if keeping the beach is your main goal, then, hard armoring is not the best choice. If protecting the upland home or port or whatever that infrastructure is, well, then there is a time and a place, for hard structures. So some of the other effects are really related to where the structure goes in the intertidal zone. So is it low? Is it higher? Is it at the toe of a bluff? And so how does that affect various organisms and species? And their use of the shoreline really varies with where that armoring goes in. So in Puget Sound, for example, even if it's, again, a port or it's a road, we try to put it in as high up on the beach as possible. So as much out of the intertidal zone, so it interacts with coastal processes and waves as little as possible. I will also mention here in a minute that there's also usually mitigation now required for any structure that goes in by anybody, which is, again, an evolution and different than it was when I first started practicing. So a lot of this is just recognizing the interconnectedness and the dynamic nature of our shorelines. So from bluffs to dunes to beaches, it's all connected. And so it's disrupting that connection is where we really start to see, a lot of the effects. You just want to be dynamic. And if they can't be dynamic, then we're going to see some kind of impact related to it. But again, it really comes down to like, what's the goal that you're trying to achieve? So in Washington State, we have the Shoreline Management Act, which is developed by the Department of Ecology. Similar to Oregon, this gets implemented at the local level, so either at the city or the county. So this is the overarching legislation, but cities or counties actually have the ability to make it more stringent than the Shoreline Management Act. They can't be less stringent, but they can be more stringent. And so essentially what this code says is that you need to avoid hard structures. If you can't avoid them, you need to minimize, which means using a soft shoreline approach, which is a lot of the nature-based coastal solution. We call it soft shorelines in Washington State. And if you can't minimize, then you're going to have to compensate or mitigate for that. Essentially offset those impacts. So the way that this sort of looks in practice is natural solutions are similar to some of the things that Meg talked about, vegetation enhancement, upland drainage control. We talk a lot about drainage and runoff. Outfalls on beaches are sort of like coastal engineers just nemesis because they're always gonna be like a hot spot of erosion. But also just uncontrolled sheet flow also can really have a negative impact. So for homes, it's important to try to control the drainage, collecting it in a rain barrel, using it for irrigation. Because it just adds additional, you think about it, it just adds additional water that wouldn't necessarily be discharging in that way if it was a natural environment. So it has a harder time penetrating because essentially we've covered up a lot of that area with our homes and structures and roads, right? So that's one of the reasons upland drainage is can often be an issue and exacerbation. And then the soft are these sort of nature-based design, biotechnical measures of beach nourishment, large wood, gravel placement, and I'm going to show some examples of what these things look like. We used to anchor trees. We don't anchor wood anymore. We've been shown that that actually really can also cause scour. It was a technique that was really used in rivers to develop scour holes for fish. So we don't want to create scour holes on the beach. So we don't anchor wood anymore. We do place wood. Cobble berms. We consider cobble berms as engineers to be a dynamic revetment. So it's still a structure. It's a softer structure, but we as an engineer still consider it to be a structural solution, a little bit different than the way that Meg was talking about it under the Oregon code. And then we have the rock revetments. Groins are short perpendicular and they're used a lot on the East Coast. I'll show an example of it where you're basically creating a cell to hold the sand and the material within that cell. There does get to be a negative feedback loop on using groins, which I'll talk about. Retaining walls, which is again, you're trying to retain the upland instead of a seawall. With seawall is batting with waves. So it's just sort of the opposite goal. Again, goes back to goals. When we're designing things as engineers, what's the goal? What's our design criteria? So the other regulatory framework that really affects what we can and can't do in Puget Sound is NOAA has put out this Puget Sound nearshore calculator. And so it's actually a method where you go, if you want to propose a hard armor, you have to go in, you put in a certain amount of information and it spits out and tells you how much mitigation is going to be required. And you can put in like beach nourishment, like, okay, I'm going to do a hard structure here, but then adjacent to it, I'm going to rebuild this beach and I'm going to add vegetation. So we try to make our projects, what we say, self-mitigating by including both soft and hard. So you'll see a lot of the things I'm going to talk about are hybrid. And that's one of the major reasons, because if we're going to build a hard structure, we need to do something to help to mitigate for that. And if you can pay into a bank, like for mitigation credits, it's always more expensive to pay into the bank than it is to try to do mitigation locally at the site. So I mentioned some of these, sort of in concept. So the first one in terms of implementation is looking at removal. Can you remove any of the existing shoreline stabilization structures and can you restore the beach? This is, one of the toughest things to do, but has some of the largest benefits. Very easy from a permitting perspective, as you can imagine. Controlling upland drainage, I mentioned that already, so I won't talk about that much more. Protect, enhance, and replace native vegetation. So vegetation really stabilizes the shorelines. It has historically, not just dune grass, but even like the forested corridor on the upland, right? So if you think about what shorelines looked like prior to us developing them, they were completely different. They were still super dynamic, but they were completely different. And so that's where this sort of regulatory code and framework comes from, is like thinking about what was there before us, which is maybe doesn't feel so practical, but that's where it came from. Relocating buildings and improvements. So you do have to be able to demonstrate that you can't move, setback, or raise a home. Obviously you want to do it before it gets to be something like this, because this home is no longer able to be relocated. And then constructing a soft shore solution, and I'll talk more specifically about that, but beach nourishment, largwood, natural elements, vegetation is always, those sort of three are the part of the soft shore solution. In our code, I will also say that a soft shore solution is still you're still doing something to the shoreline. You still have to get a permit for it. You still have to do what's called demonstrating need. I think that, so Meg used the term eligibility. So in, the Puget Sound area, we talk about demonstrating need. And the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has a very explicit, framework and code for how you demonstrate need. As an example, in King County, which is where Seattle is, you actually have to show that a structure is going to be endangered in the next 3 years in order to get a permit for either a hard structure or even beach nourishment or soft shore solution. Essentially, to do anything to the shoreline at all, you have to show that structure is going to be, it has to be like a primary structure. So either like a home, it can't be like a boathouse or a boat ramp unless it's a state park boat ramp or a municipal, a public facility. But 3 years, endangered in 3 years. And then there's hybrid solutions, which again, I'll talk a little bit more in detail. So this is showing a pocket beach. It didn't used to be there. There used to be more of a hard structure there. So they essentially built out into the intertidal using beach nourishment to create a beach in this area. And then hard armor, but hard armor always requires mitigation. Okay, so we have a little bit of design guidance. I mentioned it's an evolving, field. This is what we have in Washington State. There's something called the Marine Shoreline Design Guidelines. And so it has this cumulative risk model. And so you essentially go through a specific site and you look at, this is based on Fetch, which is a proxy for wind waves. It's a little bit of an oversimplification when we look at things on the outer coast. Like we're looking at wind waves, right? What are the wind waves? What are the erosion rates? So ideally, if you have long-term monitoring like we do in Washington, I don't know what the long-term monitoring is in Oregon, but Peter and I started the long-term monitoring in Washington State. So we have 25 years of long-term monitoring in Washington State. That's really beneficial when we're going to look at a site. We're like, yeah, where's the closest transect? And what are the erosion rates? I'll mention Westport by the Sea, which I'll show an example of, which we designed the cobble berm for that, and they were experiencing 10 feet of erosion per year. So pretty easy to demonstrate need because we actually had data to do that. Here, this is, again, the proxy for wind waves, but it's also talking about the shore type, which is the geomorphology, and then what kind of a structure do you have, what is setback, and then you can kind of come up with this cumulative risk. So this is something that we use when we're trying to demonstrate need in our reports to sort of give a standardized way of looking at any given site. And then NOAA also has some definitions, and they also talk a little bit about suitability for different techniques for vegetation, sills, which is like a low line for investment as opposed to, something that has larger rock. I think a sill is actually pretty similar to a cobble berm, really. So they go from green to gray. And again, we also look at these guidelines because we have this NOAA nearshore calculator. So they use this type of terminology. The living shorelines is very much like an East Coast terminology where they're talking about like marsh fronting dunes typically. So a few examples. So wood, large wood can be used fairly effectively to help slow erosion. What I will say before I go through all this is all of these require maintenance. Everything on the coast requires maintenance. If you own a home here and you live here, your home requires maintenance, right? The ocean is not kind to structures, and it's also not kind to coastal structures. So everything requires some amount of maintenance, even with that. So you can bury large wood. You can also add large wood to the surface. We did a big study in Puget Sound looking at large wood and trying to understand how much wood you need to add to be stable, and will it stay there? Will it not stay there? So we're just publishing that now. There'll be a webinar on that in a couple of months. But essentially what we found is that it comes in a matrix, right? So you need to have a certain amount of buried wood and a certain amount of superficial wood. The more complex, the better is really what it comes down to in terms of large wood. But it can be really beneficial to help to kind of hold and stabilize some of the sediments. Not anchor, I mentioned that before. Beach nourishment is very common technique. This is Deception Pass-Through Park. This is an old structure. There was a ferry landing, wasn't being used anymore, so we removed it. There is a buried fiber optic cable though. So this actually has large wood buried in the beach as a last line of defense for that, the fiber optic cable. If that large wood becomes exposed, we know we're getting close to the fiber optic cable, they'll go in and they'll re-nourish. So typically, we try to design projects to be self-sustaining, but like I said, almost everything requires maintenance, particularly if you have any kind of infrastructure there. So this, we're expecting, it could be 10 to 15 years, before they have to re-nourish. So we usually try to predict how long that will be. This is one of our few sandy beaches in Puget Sound. So this is Point Oh Point Park. It has the oldest lighthouse, which is off to your right, in that image. And we had a big storm event. Somebody asked if things occur episodically or slowly. So this beach was weakened by a wind wave event in November of 2022. We then got this really extreme high tide event and large wind wave event in December of 2022, and it reached the beach. There's 36 inches of water on the road and people couldn't get out of their homes. So we had actually proposed to the regulatory agencies that we go in and build a dune similar to what you have. That would require us raising the natural grade of the beach. And they said, you're gonna have to go through our full 1.5 year permitting process to do that. And the county, this is a county park, said, well, we really need to reopen our park. They were already put sandbags in place and pumped the water off the road. So they said, well, you can go in and just fix that and build it back to the way that it was now. So we added sand and we added some wood. But in order to do what you really want, which is a vegetated foredune, it's taken us 1.5 years. We now have the permits and we're going into the phase 2 of this. We often will use Hoyer matting in our foredunes in order to help to stabilize it while that vegetation is getting established. It will biodegrade, so that is a biodegradable material. So this is being constructed next month. So dynamic structures, I mentioned, so this is Westport by the Sea. So somebody asked about the scale, somebody online asked about the scale of these kinds of structures. I don't remember exactly the length of this, but it is, it's a large condominium complex. And so it was an appropriate solution and location for it. They did add cobble 2 years after we installed this. So the thing about cobble berms is they tend to spread. And so that's why on the parcel basis, it's a little bit difficult because you'd have to add such a huge volume of material just to allow for that spreading. So you're almost better off placing some material and just planning to go back and augment it. It does accrete sand on top of the cobble berm. So that's one of the reasons that it's viewed as, much better than a revetment because you can get some dune grass and revegetation of that sand. So that's going to change drastically due to my some of it's alien transport, and OSU is doing a lot of study and research of this particular cobble berm to really help learn how it's performing. I'll say that our engineering report was had a lot of caveats because again, we don't have design guidance, and that from an engineer's perspective is tough. We don't have a manual to turn to, so it's all a little experimental. This is just another, showing a couple more views. So on the left is the cobble berm. On the right is when they put in some sand fencing and they track a lot of sand and a lot of that cobble is now covered up. This was similar to a cobble berm, but it's more of a breakwater. So it's that in the yellow there, it's that point of land. So it was eroding back. So they decided this is in Bellingham Bay, which is actually a pretty high wind wave climate for Puget Sound. And so to try to reduce those erosion rates, we put in this berm breakwater to break up the wind wave energy and maintain a pocket beach behind it. I'm not sure that we would get a permit for this right now. So this, we have to mitigate for it. So this was permitted like 10 years ago. And it's done pretty well. It's certainly in terms of helping protect the pocket beach and preventing additional erosion of that parking lot. but it takes a very specific sort of shoreline shape to be able to do something like this. Geotubes are pretty similar to what you all call buoys. So this was done in ocean shores. Geotubes were started by somebody at the Army Corps of Engineers back in like the 90s, and they were sort of all the rage for a while. You could bury them, generally with beach nourishment over the top of them. Sometimes they're planted, so I guess this one is a little bit further out. The diagram I'm showing on the left kind of shows you can use them in sort of three different ways. One is like to create a dune itself as sort of the base of the dune. One is more of a cove protection, so at the sort of toe of the dune to prevent scour of the toe. And then the other one is additional vegetation, and you're physically burying it as opposed to allowing it to bury itself naturally. I would say that they're used a little bit less frequently now, mostly because they're not biodegradable. In Puget Sound, we've also been using something else, another geotextile material called Flex MXE. These are individual bags, again, also not biodegradable, but they, you can adaptively manage with them. So you can add to them over time. You could replace a part of it if it got damaged. So as opposed to having one big long geotube, you can make it a little bit more modular. So it's the pre-construction on the right, post-construction on the left. And they generally have some type of medium that promotes vegetation growth. So that's the other benefit of them. I'm not endorsing Flex MSE, I'm just letting you know what that particular material was. And then we have hard armor. So riprap revetments, the most common one, you know, we used to do more vertical seawalls. They have a larger wave reflection off of them. It's easier for waves to reflect off that vertical surface. Riprap revetments dissipate a little bit of that wave energy as they run up. Most of the time nowadays in Puget Sound, we're usually placing some kind of what we call habitat material or fish mix over the top of our revetments. So we're essentially burying them in something that's a little bit more fish friendly. And then there's, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we're often trying to also make them higher and higher up on the beach. The challenge with that is often you get scour of the toe. So with these kinds of hard structures, it's the end effect that we worry sort of the most about, as well as the toe. And that's just showing a little bit of focus on the toe where it changes slope there. And so one way that we often handle the toe is we'll do something called a self-launching toe. So you're adding additional rock that's buried. And so as it erodes back, that toe essentially discharges that rock and it ends up lower on the beach. So we often will use these again in places where it's like really critical infrastructure. Can we build them up high? And it's what we call like a last line of defense. And then I mentioned NFX. So this was actually a project where a section of revetment was removed for habitat benefits. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough consideration, and we didn't do it. There wasn't enough consideration to the end effect of this. So they got significant scour and erosion at the end, undermined this home. And so now we're going in and trying to repair and figure out what to do about this. And the road was also endangered at the same time. So this is really one of the biggest challenges, I think, that, you know, on these open coastlines in Washington and Oregon with trying to put in hard armor is where do you start and where do you stop? Because it's just a real thing that we have to deal with. And it's a very difficult thing from an engineering science. We end up often like wrapping them around, you know, and doing return walls back. You're still going to have erosion on the adjacent property, so. And then a few hybrid solutions. I have no idea how I'm doing on time. So this is Marine Park in Blaine, Washington. So up north, pretty high energy wave climate. So there's a groin, so that's shore perpendicular. There's a cobble beach, and then there's a revetment. So very much a hybrid solution. Couldn't do just offshore. It did end up being self-mitigating by adding beaches sort of in between these groin structures and adding vegetation in the shore calculator. So it was a project where not a lot else could be done. So we do get permits for hard armor in places where there's just no other options. And then, geomorphology really, again, comes to light when you're starting talking about the end effects, but also just when you're putting in hard structures. So you can, in these sort of pocket beach shapes, you can do something called a crenulate shoreline shape. It's a natural shore form that exists. So we did this this is also in Bellingham Bay, where it had a really old structure. We reduced the overall length of the structure and put it in beach nourishment. We knew that it would erode back, so we're allowing for some of that change, which is really important. If you have the space to allow some of the change and trying to reduce the amount of hard armoring, but still protecting the upland. And this is the project that I mentioned about the East Coast. So this is Edisto Island in South Carolina. So these are brine fields. And essentially, what's happened on the East Coast is we built very close to the shoreline a very long time ago, much longer ago, and we have narrower beaches to begin with. And then we put in brines, and then we filled between the brines with beach nourishment. So the beach nourishment gets pumped typically from offshore sand shoal onto the beach. We're depleting those sand sources over time. This was 850,000 cubic yards of sediment, and it goes in every 20 years. They have to go in and refill this. So I oversaw this project when we were living on the East Coast briefly. So before on the left, after on the right. So it's a solution. It's expensive. They tax the residents to maintain the beaches. That's pretty much the East Coast way. Same thing in Florida.
Can you share some numbers on that?
That project, so the 850,000 cubic yards of sand pump ashore, I want to say was how many millions? I think it was like a $15 million project.
And how long was it?
Miles, couple miles. So I'm just gonna kind of end with beaches are dynamic. So Paul Komar was like the grandfather of coastal solutions and geomorphology at OSU. And I'll never forget in my first beaches class, he showed a photo similar to what Meg showed of a house one day that was like filling with sand, and then another day, that was eroded in front of it. And that has stuck with me ever since. And it's something that I'm always thinking about when we're trying to design structures. It's like, how is this gonna change over time? What is this gonna look like in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? But all of these things require maintenance. So that's like, it's just so important to get that across. None of these are like a one and done solution. And with that, I don't take any questions.
Are there any questions from the audience? Nikki?
You mentioned the geotubes and toe scour. Is there a best practice to minimize toe scour when you're using geotubes? You mentioned how you can minimize the effects, but they were bad by pounding up extra rock that's gonna slide down over time. Is there a similar practice that can be done with the geotubes approach?
I've seen geotubes with, so we call it like an apron, a toe apron, which is also usually cobble. So it's usually buried cobble. So, it's something that's coarser that's gonna stay there ultimately. So even with geotubes, if you're getting some kind of scour, typically, cobble is gonna be, the solution with that.
So you talked about that when doing beach nourishment on the East Coast, they would pull from offshore. So what happens to that habitat that's just lost?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is like a full environmental impact assessment. So, back in the day, it was Minerals Management Service that then became following it, they became something else. But that's a federal agency that regulates offshore sand deposits. And so we had to do a lot of extensive, measurements, modeling and analysis to determine what the impacts would be. So it really just depends on what the habitat is. If it's crab habitat, if it's, I'm not coming up with anything other than crab right now, but anyway, but whatever that habitat is out there, then generally, again, it's gonna be some kind of, mitigation. So it's usually paying in to something. Those rules and regulations, I think I know they've changed somewhat, but I also know that there's a lot of discussion about like, there's just a lot of sand anymore. Like we keep extracting it, you know, and pumping it ashore and like all of our natural resources that over time, it's just doesn't exist there. So it's up to the regulatory agencies to decide if that impact is temporary or permanent. And so that's usually where kind of the rubber meets the road on that most of the time. It depends on the type of technique that they're using for the extraction of that sand. We did some work at the mouth of the Columbia River looking at dredge placement and thin layer placement versus like dumping large piles of sediment, for example, and looking at crab and how they responded to that, and they responded better to thin layer, right? So if you go in and you move in thin layers off of a large sand shoal, that's gonna be better than just like digging a giant hole in one place. That's the school of thought, but it's always changing and evolving based on the science, the biological science. So it takes a lot of people doing a lot of reports to basically come up with an understanding of what the impacts are gonna be. And then the regulatory agencies make a judgment on whether or not it needs to be mitigation, you know, paid for or not.
Seems like we have this intention of protecting the wildlife that lives in these areas, but or maybe I just don't know about it and I'd love to. Doesn't seem like there's been a lot of research or tracking on what actually happens to the ecosystem when you're doing these sorts of.
Yeah, most of the research, and again, that I'm aware of, has been around the mouth of the Columbia River related to both dredging and placement of sediment, because there, the repeated dredging was essentially thought to be causing erosion on the northern beaches, because we were removing that sediment from the system and not putting it in a place where it can make its way back onto the beach. So we, when I was at a different company, we helped look at other placement sites that were north of the North Jetties on the Columbia River and placement of sediment there, but then the crab fishermen weren't happy about that. So, you know, there's so many different stakeholders and stakeholder groups, and it's hard to make everybody happy. So I know there's been a fair bit of work done in the Columbia so that would be there's a group called CREST, which is the Columbia
River Estuary.
Yeah. Yep.
Study task force.
Yep, so they kind of are the keepers of all those reports.
Okay.
And lots of research over the last probably 40 years or longer there. Yeah.
Other questions in the audience? Okay, how about Zoom?
Got. Will.
Go ahead, Will.
Hey, thanks. Can you hear me, Jessica?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Will Rasmussen. I'm an Oregon administrative law attorney. I sometimes permit coastal erosion protective structures. Thanks for bringing your expertise down to Oregon on this. I feel your enthusiasm for non-structural solutions, and I frankly share it in many locations where they can work. I just worry that some of the people in the audience might not have caught you saying in some circumstances hard structures are necessary, particularly in Cannon Beach. You know, we've got the Acola Creek estuary. That's a unique spot, but good chunks of Cannon Beach front directly on the Pacific Ocean and eat those super high energy king tide winter storms that come and smash the coast, that give us some of the highest wave energy on the planet. And on some of my sites, I've had several engineers look at them and they say, well, I'd love to find some non-structural solution for you, but with this site, really the only thing that'll work is hard armoring. My question for you is twofold. One, would that surprise you if there are sites in Cannon Beach that a soft structure probably wouldn't work? And two, how do you tell the difference? You said you have permitted several hard structures where that's appropriate. I'm assuming that's both inside and outside of the Puget Sound. The Puget Sound obviously is a different wave environment than direct fronting on the Pacific Ocean. So what, would you take a stab at those?
Sure. First I'll say nothing surprises me. we find, you know, everything and anything on the coastlines. I will never be out of a job. I always tell people if they have, want to be an engineer, they should be coastal engineers because they'll have job security for life. So I will say, so as an example, in, sort of again in Puget Sound, there was a home, a private residence, and they had sought permits, I think, 3 different geotechnical engineers wrote reports to try to demonstrate need. Their home, they had no setback. Their deck was overhanging the shoreline. They couldn't move their home. There was, their experience what we call the coastal squeeze. There was just no space. And the county kept rejecting the reports because they didn't demonstrate need. They didn't say that they didn't need it, that there wasn't need. The reports didn't demonstrate the need that it needed to demonstrate in order to get the permit. We took one look at it, we wrote a report, they got their permit. And this was 2 years ago, you know, so this is under our current new legislation. You know, so it's either that or the land, the lot becomes unusable and unbuildable. And that's a really tough thing, right? I mean, that's like happening in Alaska where there's just like nowhere to go, or places that have really high erosion rates and they can't set it back. It's what we call the coastal squeeze. So you can, the framework in Washington State is set up such that if you're essentially going to lose your home, or lose an important port infrastructure or something like that, then you can get a permit to build a hard structure. So it's just all very site specific is what it comes down to. And you need a certain amount of data. So anybody who is having erosion, the first thing I tell them to do is take photos. Take lots of photos, take photos before storms, take photos after storms, have something in the photo that you can kind of mark the changes. Like document, it doesn't have to be a sophisticated way of documenting the changes. Document the changes though, because if you call somebody like me and I'm trying to demonstrate need, I need something to use to demonstrate that need. And if you have no data, if you have no photos, if you have no documentation, that's really difficult to do. So
I think yeah, that answers the question. Thanks. And yeah, I think your framework and Washington's framework of avoid, minimize, and mitigate, or I think you called it avoid, minimize, and compensate, makes a lot of sense. Oregon doesn't use that language yet. They might more in this new process, but I think that's a helpful framework for what I think everybody's trying to do. So thanks.
Just to clarify, in Washington, need is loss of infrastructure within 3 years, correct?
So in King County, so at the state level, they don't determine the number of years that there's gonna be a loss. So they leave that up to the city and the counties. So each one's a little bit different, but many of them are starting to adopt this 3-year. In Grays Harbor County, so on the Washington coast, it's not that explicit yet. Because I think up until now, they weren't seeing as many requests for hard armor. You know, I think it's a lot of, like, when I went to school in Oregon, there was hardly any hard armor, you know, on the Oregon coast, I think 25 years ago. So it's changing as our beaches are eroding back to where we have constructed infrastructure. But they are getting more and more permits. Cobble berms seem to be the thing that everyone's turning to. But I will say that the city of Ocean Shores is looking at a cobble berm, and it's not appropriate in every solution. You need some kind of dune or some kind of structure to build that cobble berm against. You can't just mound cobble up like in front of a road as like a dune shape and expect it to just stay there. That's not gonna work. It's not gonna hold. So there's a appropriateness, you know, for any of these solutions. It's just super site specific, and so you need somebody like me, and there aren't enough. So. Yeah.
So I just following up on the last question. So you said that in Puget Sound, you have to show danger within the next 3 years.
Mhm.
What do you mean by danger? Do you mean just losing some beachfront, or do you mean losing your house?
Yes,
What is
so
danger?
it has to be critical infrastructure, which is either a residential home, not a boathouse, not a septic system counts, like some kind of primary infrastructure, septic system, home, Court building, road, so yeah, not like a staircase or, yeah, a single access point, things like that don't count. So it's explicit in our code, what counts and what doesn't count. So either a primary residence or a major piece of infrastructure or utility. And it's King County implements it as endangered in 3 years, which basically means if it's a home, it's gonna be red tagged and uninhabitable in 3 years. If it's a road, it's gonna be undermined and, start to fail in 3 years. So essentially, it's gonna be non-usable within a 3-year time period. And that's just so that you can get a structure without doing any mitigation. If you wanna mitigate, then it's a little bit easier, but not a lot.
We have somebody else on Zoom.
Yeah, Cameron.
Cameron?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving us some perspective from Washington. That's really helpful because it's a similar coastline, but not the same framework that we use. You mentioned two kinds of coastline protective structures that we don't use or see very much in Oregon, at least not that I'm familiar with, breakwaters and groins. And I am just wondering if either of those can be useful as tools in the toolkit when you're dealing with what we mostly have, which is, as Will mentioned, towns on the outer beach. We don't have a big coastline, inner coastline like Puget Sound. And so we get big heavy storms that come crashing onto the outer beaches. And I am wondering if breakwaters and groins are useful possibilities in our kinds of situations, or if they are more likely usable in quieter areas such as Puget Sound.
I'll start with breakwaters because that's easier to answer. So breakwaters you're not gonna be able to use a breakwater on like a linear shoreline in Washington and Oregon. We just have too much, it's too dynamic. And the wave climate is too large. It's not gonna work. It's not gonna be effective. They're typically used more like in front of marinas or harbors or, sort of semi-enclosed bodies of water where you're trying to break up the wave energy from propagating into that kind of an area. But yeah, so I would say no to breakwaters. Groins do what they do. They disrupt littoral transport. And so one of the reasons that some of the areas in Washington, outer coast of Washington, have started eroding more rapidly is because of jetties. So you think of groin as just being like a jetty, but on the beach. And so you're blocking the movement of sediment along shore. So sediment moves on and offshore as well as along shore. When it moves on and offshore, it's typically stored in offshore bars, and then it mostly makes its way back onto the beach. Not necessarily every year, but over multiple years sometimes. So sandbars form, they march towards the beach, they meld to the beach, and then the cycle happens all over again. But then there's also a transport of material along the shore. And so groins basically stop that transport of material along the shore. So somebody will benefit and somebody will suffer with groins. So that's the trade-off with groins. And you'll get an accumulation of sediment on one side of the groin, and then you'll get an erosion on the other side. So you kind of get these little mini pocket beaches that form in between them. So are they effective? They do what they're designed to do if they're designed properly, but that's what they're designed to do. Does that answer your question? So yes, they could be used in Oregon and Washington. I mean, they are a well-documented coastal structure.
Okay, yes, thank you. That does. One other follow-up. Am I correct to say that the infamous Washaway Beach situation does not involve groins, but does involve a variety of natural solutions?
Yeah, everything under the sun has been attempted at Washaway Beach. So yes, it's not involved groins, but almost everything has been attempted at Washaway Beach. It's at the beginning of a drift cell, which means that it's like where the sediment sort of would be sourced. And again, when we think about the jetties and the disruption of drift along shore, that's kind of where Washaway Beach has really suffered. And we've seen other places. Fort Canby State Park is similar to that. It's north of the North Jetty at the Columbia River, which has eroded back because it's not getting sediment from the south moving towards it. So that's Washaway Beach doesn't have a sediment supply. So that goes back to what I said about maintenance. All of these solutions require maintenance, whether you're putting in beach nourishment, if you don't have a supply to resupply that sediment, you're gonna have to add it artificially.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else on Zoom?
Yeah, Clay.
Go ahead, Clay.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Jessica, thank you for being here. My name is Clay Newton. I serve on the Planning Commission. Really appreciate your unique perspective. It sounds like you've worked with both more traditional riprap, hard structures, and some of the softer structures. So we appreciate that. It's not the perspective we've had much of on the Planning Commission. And as you can imagine, we've had a number of these cases more recently coming before us where we really struggle to find that balance between protecting the beach, this top 10 beach in the world, versus our homeowners who have real concerns about their homes, and trying to find that balance. Mr. Rasmussen and my fellow commissioners and I have had plenty of opportunity to talk this through, many an evening, some bordering into the morning sometimes. The idea of what will work, this definition of what would or wouldn't work, is something we've really haggled with quite a bit, from something that might work for a season, say dumping sand on the in front of the properties, to, we really haven't discussed it, but it's been done, putting a seawall in place, which, would last much longer, but, at what expense? So there's this balance we're trying to find constantly. So I guess my question is, in your experience with this unique perspective, how, and you also said everything needs maintenance, and there's a timeline associated with that, but with your unique perspective, how do you define success when you talk to homeowners about what they're putting in place and what they're getting back for it? And how do you measure success?
Great question. So I think it comes down to that timeline. So we always try to define what the expected maintenance cycle is in a project. And so, we're always expecting things to change. How quickly is it going to change is what we're trying to predict. We're trying to just slow the erosion process. We try to be really transparent with everybody about that. We're trying to slow it. We can't stop it. We can't just halt nature, like that's just not gonna happen. So if we can accurately define what that maintenance cycle is, and we say, you're gonna need to renourish in 3 to 5 years, and something lasts for 5 years, well, to us, that's success, because it's like, yep, that performed as we expected. So maybe it's a performance criteria, is really kind of how we can meet the performance criteria that we determine as engineers. Then to us, that is success. Now, other people are going to define success in a totally different way, right? So the biologists might not define success in the same manner as we do. But we try to stick in our wheelhouse. We work closely with biologists. We always try. I think Will pointed to my enthusiasm. I love the beach. And that's why I'm a coastal engineer. So obviously, I want the beach to be there as long as possible, as we all do, right? And so that's why I'm passionate about it. So we do everything we can, to try to minimize impacts. But there's trade-offs every single time. So yeah, for us, it's being able to meet the performance criteria that we set out for that project.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else on Zoom? Very good question.
Yeah, quick one. When you referred to armored structures, that starts on the less armored side at vegetated riprap.
Riprap doesn't get vegetated, so I would say, so we start usually with what we call a dynamic structure, which would be a cobble berm or something So you're putting something on the beach that wouldn't be there naturally. Cobble is not typically on our sand beaches in large quantities, right? So that in itself is just a structure because it's not something that would naturally occur at that location. But then it goes from a cobble berm being just kind of a minimal sort of structure because it can still deform and change to something like a riprap revetment that's designed to basically not move under certain conditions. So we usually use like a 50-year wind wave criteria when we're sizing rock, for example. So it's like, okay, under a 50-year storm event, that rock's not gonna go.
There's no, difference between riprap and vegetated riprap. I mean, I think vegetated riprap is something that's in our code, is that?
Oh,
That's correct. In our hierarchy, it starts with riparian vegetation that's existing, to maintaining that. And then the second is to vegetate. And then the third is to provide vegetated riprap. So you're planting over riprap, so you put a sand blanket and then you vegetate. And then it's riprap with no vegetation, and that happens more in Lincoln County where vegetation just can't.
okay.
And then seawalls and bulkheads.
Okay, that's something that's not a traditional coastal engineering design, and I would say in general, if we're placing something over riprap, we're not expecting it to stay there very long.
Seems like we've had some pretty successful examples
Yeah.
here. where
Okay, great,
The riprap does get covered with vegetation
Okay.
and remains, though.
yeah,
I agree and appreciate the point that everything needs maintenance.
Yeah.
So if we consider those the armored solutions, just to the other side of armoring, we're just talking about cobbled berms, is that, or?
cobble berms and
Because
then,
I think we have a lot of struggles with trying to figure out, what's a less structural solution, what's
Yeah.
a nature-based solution.
yeah.
And then,
I heard Meg say that, cobble berms are considered non-structural solutions in the Oregon code. So it sounds to me as though if you're doing a vertical concrete wall, you're doing a riprap revetment, those are structural. But if you're doing a cobble berm, beach nourishment, large wood, even very large wood, it sounds like any of those sort of natural elements, would be considered non-structural in Oregon's code. That was my takeaway from what Meg said in looking at her slide. So it sounds like Oregon's taking a little bit of a, they're not considering cobble berms to be a structure. That's different in Washington.
and as far as the burrito.
The burrito,
That's
Yeah.
been talked about.
Yeah. as
Where
long
does
as,
that fit in there?
so as long as the burrito has biodegradable materials, so it has like Hoyer matting or, like it's made of like coconut fibers and can biodegrade, then that would be considered a non-structural solution. If it was a geotube, like a geotextile fabric that's like a synthetic material that's not meant to degrade, then what I heard Meg say was that's actually considered a structural solution. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had a follow-up on one of the previous answers for measures of success.
Yeah.
Are there performance criteria standards for return for maintenance and things of that nature that you guys?
For any particular,
For
anything?
anything, like, is there a criteria for?
the Army Corps of Engineer manual has some of the, performance criteria in it. I would say that it doesn't cover cobble berms, because those are newer, or it has a little bit of dynamic revetments, but it's pretty loose. Beach nourishment, it's basically just based on your erosion rate. So it's basically, you need to know what the erosion rate is. And the other thing that we talk about with beach nourishment is that it's fluffier than natural sediment that you place down. I like to think of it as having cured in place. And so you're gonna expect a higher erosion rate when you place nourishment than of a natural beach. So, sometimes we use like, factor 2, that's kind of a judgment call, but, so there's a little bit of guidance in the Army Corps of Engineers manual, but it's pretty site specific. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the rock, I would say for structures, it's pretty clear, like you're gonna size a rock for the calculated wind wave. This is how big the rock needs to be in order for it to stay. We have lots of manuals on that.
Okay, but for the software armoring, it's a little squishier in terms
It's a
of.
little squishier, it's evolving, yeah.
I just wanted to say, Gary, so part of the reason that it's so valuable to have you here is, like you mentioned, in Washington, it used to be easy to get these permits for hard armoring, and then that changed. And that pushed your expertise, I mean, correct me, but yeah, your expertise into this new area of hybrid and nature-based. And where you don't have the policy guidance yet, as Meg said, it's coming. And so we don't have those examples. The only ones that we have are the few, like the common berms that the state has implemented on state land. So can you talk a little more about, because I think, you know, you keep saying it's site specific, so it's not like, my impression is that when you get an assignment, you don't go there and go, I'm gonna put in X, Y, Z. It's that you have to look, and that oftentimes it is more of a hybrid solution, which makes it more difficult for policy writing.
Yeah.
Down here in town, so like Gary's saying, like, where do the burritos fit in this?
Yeah.
But maybe it won't be the burrito, you know, maybe it will be I'm forgetting the flax, you know.
Or flags on a Z, yeah. Yeah, so that's a good question. So I didn't mention this at all. So one of the things that we have to do in our demonstration of need is we have to do alternatives analysis. So we actually have to show that we've considered X, Y, and Z. So that we've considered more, we don't just come in and say, this is what you need. So we actually have to demonstrate why that is the only solution that will work, and why a softer solution wouldn't work, or a moving wouldn't work, for example. So there is a full-blown alternative analysis. So anytime you go to a site, like we do lots of study, and you do what's called a feasibility study, right? We'll come up with a whole set of alternatives, a range of alternatives from soft to hard and hybrid, everything in between. That's my daughter.
She's doing that for you.
And so that's part of the, it's provided to the regulatory agencies for them to review, to understand, yes, we have indeed thought about the full range of solutions, and this is why these won't work, and this is the that we have selected. And money is actually, one of the things in the code, believe it or not. The cost, like it's cost prohibitive, especially for, single family residential. That's actually, is something that's considered. I've never seen a decision made on that, but it is in the code. Yeah, so there's a full range of solutions. And I'll say that I think for the open coast, it's really important to look to the East Coast and what's happened there, and how we've kind of gotten to the cycle that we've gotten into in terms of that maintenance and structures, and just making sure that we're all going into that with our eyes wide open. Because I think that that's one of the hard things for people who want a one and done. They come to us, they think we're like the plumber, right? We're just gonna like go in and, you know, fix the shower, and it's just gonna work, and it's gonna work for the next 50 years. But that's not the case.
I'm curious what that evidence looks like.
Yeah.
That a less armored solution doesn't work, because that's what we get to, and it kind of comes back to the question of what do we consider working, what's success? So what does that evidence look like that a lesser
In the East Coast, you mean?
So we too require an analysis.
Oh,
Of softer structures, you know, less harmful all the way up as justification for hard armoring.
Right, okay.
But it may just be one sentence, you know, because of the high, like Mr. Rasmussen said, because of our high wave energy, soft armoring will not work here.
Yeah.
Hard burn will not work here because it's one lot. So it may just be one or two sentences.
Okay.
And the question is always like, is that thorough and legitimate evaluation?
I see. So, so I'll use Westport by the Sea as an example. So again, they have 25 years of data to calculate erosion rates. We did a wind wave model So and that model is calibrated. So we often will do wind wave measurements. We didn't do it for there, meaning it was clear what the erosion rates were, but if we don't know what the erosion rates are, then we're gonna be doing a lot of technical studies and analysis in order to be able to justify our costs. So how high are the wind waves? Do you need to do a sediment transport evaluation? Can you actually calculate the erosion rate? Based on that wind wave climate, not just a high wind wave climate, like it requires a lot of detailed data and analysis and modeling in order for us to demonstrate the need. So, I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So it's not cheap, I will say that, especially for single family residential. I will mention just another program in Washington State that I think has been really beneficial in terms of helping single family residential. It's called Shore Friendly. And so they're doing it on the Outer Coast too. And so the counties or the city, so every county essentially has one. A lot of the nonprofits are the lead, sometimes it's the county. They have contracts with folks like me. There's like three small, we're a 10-person company, so three small coastal engineering companies in Washington State who do a lot of this. And they send us out for free to a property owner's site to do a free technical site assessment. It's a very high level, but it's like, what's your major problem? What's your concern? And we talk to them about possible alternatives. You know, what are they looking at? What are the challenges they're facing? And we write a report. So it costs roughly like $3,000, between $2,000 and $3,000 per site visit. We usually try to do it as a collection of like a couple of property owners all in the same vicinity to make it a little bit, less expensive. But if there's a recognition that single family residential, it's expensive and it's challenging and difficult. It's also just difficult to get some time from somebody like me because we're swamped, quite frankly. And we don't work a lot for single family residents. We do a lot of like really big projects. So it's been a huge success, and I know a lot of property owners are thrilled with it, and in a lot of it, they'll get some actionable things, like you should plant this, or you should consider large wood, or, best management practices for them living on the shoreline, and just some one-on-one education about their particular site. So, it's called Shore Friendly. And it's administered through the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's grant funded, through Washington State. Yeah. So it's been a great program. Yeah.
Can you talk more about those conversations that you have at home with homeowners? Because when the status quo has been, I can easily get riprap installed. And my belief is that it's gonna last 50 years and I'm probably not gonna do maintenance or maybe a little bit. And now you're talking about a 5-year, timeline. That's a real adjustment and reorientation. So can you talk, this is new for a lot of people in this community. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, the conversations aren't easy. I grew up on the East Coast and my family had a house on Cape Cod, and they experienced extensive erosion, so I too, grew up living on the shoreline. So a lot of it is about empathy, but in the end, our regulations are very clear. So I think that makes my job a lot easier because I can be like, these are the rules and the regulations that I have to adhere to, right? And so unless you want to pay mitigation bank, as a single family residential is really gonna have a tough time making a project self-mitigating, so you just don't have space there. So they're gonna be paying a mitigation bank in addition to like building armor. So unless it's like, again, really a clear cut case where it's like, yeah, that house is gonna like fall into the water, in a year. It's just an education of, we just need to change. We need to allow for them to change as much as we can. What are other control your drainage, right? And we add vegetation. Are we, topping trees that are gonna actually then suffer and experience disease? And, those are really like good root systems, are you removing vegetation? So what are things that you can do, or not do in order to maintain what you have there? And so, yeah, and also sometimes it depends on how long they've lived there. So that's a big part of it that I find is that if somebody's relatively new, that first big storm, they're just like, you know, they're freaking out about it. And, but that doesn't happen every year. So just a recognition too, that like a big storm will create a big change, but the beach might recover from it. So, they're not easy conversations, but they're important ones to have, to just recognize what it means, you know, to live on the shoreline and with those dynamics.
And what would you pay, what would a single residence need to pay to the mitigation fund? I mean, ballpark, I know you can't.
Oh. It generally doubles the cost of a project. Okay. So if it's a $300,000 revetment, you know, it's gonna be $600,000 kind of. That's what the rules on.
Okay. Sorry, but I do.
No, that's my here, take advantage of me.
So, if you have a homeowner that has a lower lying property, on the beach. And, there is riprap on the other side. And they have, I like the green to gray. I like the way you put that because it'll be easy to remember. And they've done the things leading up to, including cobble, it hasn't worked. Then what do you, I mean, how does that?
I mean, there are certain states, it used to be in Washington, but it's changed a little bit. There used to be sort of like, if your neighbor each has hard armor, you basically can just get a permit to put in hard armor as well to fill that gap. It has changed a little bit, because again, you need to be able to demonstrate need, and just losing lawn or losing beach isn't enough to demonstrate need. You have to show that, again, your home is under threat. But there are still some states that have that code, that if there's a gap there, you're gonna fill it in, but the recognition of Washington is like, that's kind of how we got to the situation that we're in, where we have the domino effect. So I don't have a good answer for that, because there aren't great solutions, to be honest with you, you know? You basically, the beaches are rowed kind of into a crescent shape between those two structures. It will cut back to some point that there will become some kind of sort of equilibrium for a period of time, but then you could, if you totally lost your foredune or the other sort of natural defenses, then kind of all bets are off. So. Okay. Oh.
So I'm gonna give you some background for Councilor Hammond's question.
Okay.
It was a riprap application that we just had, and she said that that was less than 50 cubic yards off the toe.
Oh, okay.
And,
Yeah.
they counted their lawn as the first attempt
Okay.
of existing riparian, and then the second was they attempted to plant some, European beach grass, and that did not do enough.
Yeah.
And so then the next was to put less than 50 cubic yards
Sure.
of, cobble at the toe.
Yeah.
And then they're jumping to riprap. So this
I see.
has stirred up a lot of conversation, and Councilor Hayes' question of, what is nature based?
Yeah.
What is critical?
Sure.
So just to,
Yeah, and if you, are Westport by the Sea, report. I can send it if people are interested in seeing it. So we looked at all of the cobble berms that had been, installed in Washington, Oregon, and California. And we did an analysis of those to see how they performed in order to design a cobble berm at Westport by the Sea, so to come up with the accurate thickness, as best we could. I will say in general, more is just better. Like we will go, if we'll put a factor of safety as engineers, that's what we do, it's a factor of safety. So we'll add additional cobble if there's sort of a question, right? So we'll be a little bit conservative in that. So it takes a certain volume of material. Same thing with beach nourishment, like we had some of the same issues in Washington where people were using beach nourishment as mitigation, but it was like, a half foot of sand in a place that maybe sand's not gonna stay. You might need something larger, like it's a mixed sand and gravel beach, which means that you need more than just sand, and it would just wash away. So that's not appropriate mitigation. So the mitigation has to be in place for 10 years. Is the requirement, and we get do a certain amount of monitoring. So if you're planting, it has to be there for 10 years. So you have to show and demonstrate that it stays and it sticks and it works. So I guess, yeah, it's a specialized field and it takes specialized engineers who really understand coastal processes in order to be able to design these things.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, are you still with us, Peter?
You guys ready for more? It's impressive. My students said OSU would be long on there. Well, thanks very much for having me as well. Even though it says civil engineering on the main plate there, my degrees are in civil engineering, but I'm a professor in the College of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at OSU. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the coastal hazards that are kind of forcing the situations that we've been talking about for the last couple of hours, and just really amazing conversation and presentations by Meg and Jessica. Thank you, Jessica. So these are a couple of videos of the kinds of things that are causing people to want to think about solutions. So high water level events that are causing beach erosion, dune erosion, overtopping, flooding of backshore infrastructure, et cetera. And then a couple of quotes from the kind of the coastal research literature that are kind of at a global scale, thinking about what potential climate impacts might have in terms of these hazards. Things like flooding might be projected to double every 5 years in the 21st century due to sea level rise, the number of people that might be living within FEMA hazard zones type of things at the end of the century, and then maybe folks around the world being forced to live in different places. So these are the global statements from the coastal literature, and I'll try to bring some of this home to Oregon as well as to Cannon Beach. So these are the things that I'll be talking about, in particular coastal erosion. I'll be mostly talking about beach erosion, but also the processes that go into dune erosion and bluff erosion as well. We're all very familiar with this. And then the term has come up a couple of times, this kind of concept of coastal squeeze. It's effectively, whether or not we have slowly eroding backshore bluffs, cliffs, and or we're actually armoring the coastline with sea level rise and continued coastal beach erosion. Eventually you lose some of that beach recreation service, as well as become a less safe beach as well. So this is, Night Beach in Newport doesn't often look like this. It's usually got as many people as you saw on the beach today during nice weather, but this is the kind of thing that happens more and more with sea level rise. All right, so just to kind of bring us all on the same page in terms of the kind of major drivers in terms of the climate controls on changing kind of the resilience of our coastal communities to these hazards of erosion and flooding. Clearly sea level rise is happening and it's projected to get worse. I'll give you some more numbers in a second. In Oregon, we have a lot of longshore variability of our sea level rise rates, our relative sea level rise rates. That's because we live in the Cascadia subduction zone, and so we have tectonic uplift that dictates what the local levels are, but eventually everything's going to be sea level rise and ultimate land everywhere, not in the distant future. I think we all are aware of what El Niños, major El Niños do coastal processes in Oregon. We're learning more and more that yes, El Nino, the major El Niños in 2015, 16, 97, 98 have, they're big whammies, they elevate water levels and waves, et cetera. But we also have lower frequency oscillations, things along the lines of Pacific decadal oscillations. Instead of moving one direction, maybe to the north for years to decades, and then starting to move to the south in some cases. And there's a lot of evidence that are building about that. And then there's a lot of trends and variability in storming patterns that are really good at dictating the things that are causing the problems that we're experiencing in terms of beach erosion and flooding. So this is, I just downloaded this plot yesterday from NOAA just to kind of get us all on the same page in terms of, this is the global mean sea level record for the last 30 some odd years. It's about a little over 3 millimeters per year. That's about double the 20th century rates. So this is a linear trend. There's a lot of scientists that actually have shown that the rates are definitely accelerating. So this is about 4 inches the last 30 years or so. And then here's a couple of most recent US projections that are very consistent with the ICCE, the climate change report, the international body. And that green line in between is basically, if you just project the world's tide gauge observations and satellite observations into the future. you still get a couple of feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, even with just today's rates that we're experiencing now. There's a wide range of variability in terms of what the future projections are, has to do with emissions, has to do with how ice melts, has to do with a lot of things. But this is the kind of uncertainty that we're under in terms of thinking about what might be happening to our beaches, dunes, bluffs, et cetera, and structures. All right, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this, but again, we live in Cascadia, so this is really a lot of our geomorphology and processes are defined by the Cascadia subduction zone. We're mostly talking about the chronic hazards of erosion and flooding here. Of course, you guys are all well aware of the big one and the near field CSE earthquake and tsunami. But you know, that overall geology dictates, as I said, our geomorphology and the kind of beaches we have in terms of the makeup of our region, in terms of sandy beaches, mixed sediment beaches, cobble beaches. So they do exist, you know, near a lot of our headlands along the Oregon coast. So it is a kind of a feature that exists in nature and why engineers are using it to help protect the coastline. And then a little bit has come up in terms of the influence of El Niños and just the extreme winter wave climate. A 9 to 10 meter significant wave height anywhere else in the world would be the biggest wave that is experienced, like during major hurricanes on the East Coast. That's our annual big storm event that we have here off the Oregon coast. So we have a very unique situation, right? I'm gonna just take 1 second to just tell you about a project that I've been involved with for the last 4 years or so. It's a 5-year NSF funded effort called the Cascadia Coast Hub. It's allowed me to do a lot of the work with the students that I'm going to show you tonight, students at OSU. The idea here is to really work at a Cascadia scale, so that's basically Northern California up through the Salish Sea in Washington, thinking about these both chronic and acute hazards and kind of the problems that communities are having and working with communities to try to increase their coastal resilience. So this is sort of our kind of overall overview. So if you don't know about the effort, I encourage you to ask me about it later, look at our webpage. There's a lot of resources and more data sets being put up onto that website, story maps, et cetera, that kind of are getting at some of the results that we're working on in terms of quantifying the coastal hazards, both chronic and acute, and some of the adaptation mitigation options that folks are using. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is a lot of kind of very recent data that a couple of PhD students that have worked with me at OSU have put together, and are really focusing on a variety of proxies for quantifying the coastal hazards that we're experiencing in this region. So on the right-hand side, there's basically 3 relatively straightforward proxies that are calculated via what we call a total water level analysis. So we're basically just calculating how high the water level gets on the beach relative to things in the back shore. So if we basically are reducing the amount of usable beach, we talk about that in terms of safe beach recreation hours, so a proxy that's focused on that. How often do the waves actually bang into the bluffs or the dunes or the structures that are back in the future? So that's kind of a collision hour proxy. Think about it, how often we might experience backshore erosion. And then the images I showed in the movies earlier, overtopping, this certainly doesn't happen very much here in Cannon Beach, I don't think in general, but a lot of our barrier spits in Oregon in front of some of the estuaries, we do have overtopping. And then on the left-hand side, just shoreline change as a proxy for coastal erosion, not the actual edge of the dune or the bluff, but actually what's going on with the beach itself. So there's a variety of ways that we've quantified this over the years, but that red line is basically kind of our way of kind of determining the difference between that wet beach and the dry beach. And that's what we refer to as the shoreline, and quantifying that shoreline change over the years. It's kind of what Jessica was referring to in terms of what's that rate of erosion in many cases. There's been a lot of techniques that we've used over the years to quantify that. And what I'll be getting at is kind of some of these results. I'll show them at kind of the Cascadia scale, but then try to drill down to Cannon Beach as well. This is work by a variety of students that have worked with my research group over the last couple of years. All right, but to step back a little bit, amazingly, in Oregon and Washington, it wasn't until 2012 that we actually had the first kind of comprehensive shoreline change data set, where shoreline change was calculated consistently everywhere in the region. This was funded by the U.S. Geological Survey. And we did this basically from the border of California and Oregon off through Washington and calculated sandy beach erosion rates everywhere using a variety of techniques. The oldest maps that we can find going back to the 1800s, aerial photographs, and then LiDAR, sort of the new technique and technology that kind of came on in the mid-90s that we were implementing and calculating new shorelines. And so what's shown in that right-hand side is basically kind of a literal cell by literal cell average of whether or not the shorelines were eroding, they were accreting, or they were relatively stable. Accreting meaning just building out more sand over time. And you can see that little sliver of Cannon Beach, the second literal cell down from the Columbia River, had a pink red color. So it was actually erosional in the 1967 to 2012. And I think I had the data set for Cannon Beach here. And so what this line, the squiggly line basically represents is our calculated rate of shoreline change for Cannon Beach from 1967 to 2012. And you can see that most of the data is actually to the right of that black vertical line. So that means the majority of the cell was actually erosional during that time period. The average erosion rate was about a half a meter per year. So it's about 1.5 feet of erosion per year over that time period. It's very specific to 1967 to 2002. We found that 75% of the kind of transects, the locations that we analyzed, were eroding, and 25% were eroding at a rate of greater than minus 1 meter per year. But you see there's a little bit of a trend, more erosion in the south, a little bit of stability as you get towards the northern part of the littoral zone. So that's what we published a little over a decade ago. In 2016, another LiDAR flight was flown over the coast of Oregon, and we did an analysis of shoreline evolution from that period of 2002 to 2016 to try to make that data set a little bit more modern. And now we're comparing the three time periods, 67 to 2002, 2002 to 2016. And in this case, actually, Cannon Beach switched colors. It actually became slightly accretional. We just looked at that period of 2002 to 2016. And it was one of only a couple of littoral cells in the state of Oregon that actually switched from erosion to accretion. In fact, many littoral cells switched and became more erosional. That was sort of the overall trend, more pinks than greens and blues. Actually compared directly the two data sets that are shown here. Green is the one that had 2002 to 2016, a little bit more stability, a little bit more accretion in places. I mean, these are relatively, thank you, Jessica, for modest rates. But it's a little bit of a change from the previous time period. All right, so that brings me up to the kind of the present day. All those data sets I was showing you looked at a couple of different images or LiDAR data sets and made these calculations of shoreline change. What's happened over the last 5 or so years in the coastal science field is basically satellite derived images and use of machine learning techniques to actually extract that wet dry line from the satellite record has allowed us to go back to basically the beginning of that record, and the Landsat record goes back to 1984, and extract shoreline positions back in time at an incredibly high frequency in time. Now, the spatial resolution, every individual shoreline estimate is less highly resolved than the LiDAR data sets that I was just showing you, but the temporal resolution is actually spectacular. And so we actually now have at least a month of every month of a shoreline position from about 1984. This always happens when I talk. Apparently, it's a very controversial topic. It was not for me. Okay, so we are now extracting the same kind of information, rates of shoreline change, but now using this record of satellite-derived shorelines from 1984 all the way to 2014. And this data set is literally right off the presses. Most Tahar Khani graduated about 2 weeks ago. He made some of these plots for me just late last week. You can see the rates of change. This is now Cascadia wide, have been relatively stable. Kind of flip around a little bit through time. But let me kind of zoom into Cannon Beach. You see an image that's actually relatively similar to that 1967 to 2002. You see the erosion on the southern end of the little cell, and a little bit of progradation on the north-hand side, right? So, every kind of estimate like this has an error bar associated with it. There's uncertainty, But in terms of the temporal resolution of this record, this is the best that's really ever been done for the coast of Oregon, certainly for Cannon Beach. So the squiggly line is the rate of change, and then if you prefer to look at it in terms of the color map, as was shown here, that the next picture, basically the same information, where the reds are areas that are eroding a little bit more rapidly. And the nice thing about this data set is it really brings us up right to the present, right? So it's really exciting, and we're taking advantage of this in many ways. One of the ways that we're taking advantage of it is looking at the trends and variabilities of these different cycles. And so I mentioned the influence of El Niños causing, potentially erosion in many Oregon beaches. 97, 98 was a big event, et cetera. We're also seeing low frequency variability. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but basically what this plot shows at the top is that during El Niños, Cannon Beach erodes during the winter time. I think that's pretty obvious. During La Niñas, it's accreting. That's relatively new information. You haven't had the records yet to really document that everywhere. But we've seen this in pretty much every little cell in Oregon and Washington. And then with this, the bottom panel, which is simply a space-time plot. These tripping colors here representing the evolution of the system here. Seasonal variability, interannual variability, and we're able to basically develop models to try to predict what happened in the past, as we call hindcasting the shoreline change. And then if those models are doing a decent job, try to run them forward with our understanding of what sea level might do, what the wave planet might do, and see if we can make some predictions of what the shoreline in Cannon Beach might look like to the future. So this is now using a different color scheme, so sorry about that. This top panel is exactly the same data I just showed you. It was a little bit confusing, but you get space vertically here and then time to the right, and just showing the alternating cycles of reds being when the beach is relatively eroded, blues are when the beach is relatively accreted. We've gotten rid of the overall trends here, and so it's really what we call the anomalies, but it allows us to kind of really kind of drill down on what's going on with El Niño behavior, longer term cycles like the Pacific Bay Field Oscillation, et cetera. And so what the bottom panel is, and I'm not going to go into any details unless you want me to, a little after 8, you can go until 9:30 if you want. I can show you the equations of Mohsen's model, but basically he's trying to reproduce that seasonal variability, trying to reproduce what's happening during El Niños. And you can see he does a reasonably okay job of getting some of this variability. You can see the seasonal signal in there. You get some reds when nature had some reds, some blues when nature had some blues. So we're getting that low frequency cycle in there as well. And this is just simply running a record of the waves that occurred off of the Oregon coast, bringing them up to right offshore of Cannon Beach, and running a numerical model that has some physics in it that is moving sediment around. We're actually reproducing that result. So that gives us a little bit of confidence that we can go forward, at least to make some stabs at thinking about what might happen into the future. And so this is literally right off the presses. It's not published yet. It's not gone to the peer review literature yet. But most of them did graduate and get a PhD, so we see that that far. What I'm showing here are 3 different panels. These are 3 different sea level rise scenarios. The 2 bars represent the bar on the right-hand side of each of the panels represents the projection of shoreline evolution, basically between 2025 and the end of the century, in terms of how much erosion this model was actually predicting with these different sea level rise rates. And you can see that the colors get more and more orange and more red with a higher sea level rise rate, which makes sense. Sea level causing us to lose beach, lose sediment offshore. And the bar on the left-hand side is an attempt to kind of classify and categorize the kind of change we might experience. Whether or not we're just losing a little bit of beach with the sea level rise, or actually the beach might erode all the way up to the structure or the bluff, the existing dune. We're not in this modeling scheme, we're not trying to model how the dunes are evolving or will the bluffs continue to retreat back. We're basically assuming that we have an existing beach width now, and if we're eroding past that beach width, we get to these red colors. You can see again with sea level rise and a beach that's fixed in place, you want to losing quite a bit of beach with these models with certainly the high sea level rise scenarios towards the end of the century. So again, this is information that is literally right off the press, but we will be working through the peer review process to get this stuff published, and then it'll be served on a variety of different websites, including the Cascadia stuff. All right, so very briefly, Another student graduated about a year ago, and she looked at these total water level proxies. So a little bit of a different kind of look on things, but thinking about, the safety or recreational use of the beach, when we might start losing that service, when the backshore might start eroding, and when certain places might start experiencing overtopping, using the same sea level rise scenarios and the same kind of modeling framework to actually generate the waves and the processes. I'm not gonna go into a huge amount of detail, but the model is able to, at any given transect of sandy beach along the Cascadia shoreline, we basically calculated the seasonal variability of all these three metrics, the time evolution of these three metrics, we averaged them over different decades. Clearly, with higher sea level rise scenarios, this beach squeeze process kicks in, you start losing that recreation beach, you get more backshore erosion. In this case, we're not actually calculating the physics of sediment transport and morphology change. We're just saying things will potentially get worse through time. So the kinds of things that Meredith was able to do with this is actually able to calculate these metrics over literal cell averages again. And I'm just going to very briefly show the results for 3 different sea level rise scenarios for all of the Cascadian coastline. And the first result here was that the northern Washington coast, where we have a lot more kind of mixed sediment beaches and cobble beaches, bluff back and cliff back shorelines with lower tow elevations, and then in California, it had some similarities to that. These areas had more of these hotspots in terms of the hazards in today's climate than we do along a lot of the central Oregon coast. So that's some potential good news. With low sea level rise projections, we didn't see a lot of change in these metrics, but as you start moving into the higher sea level rise scenarios, you see where these pinks and reds start showing up. And that's when we start losing some of these recreation services, the beaches get less safe. One of the things that Meredith did was try to normalize the rate of change by the end of the century with how bad that hazard was today. And basically came up with a hotspot index. And you see actually that northern, the central to northern Oregon coast actually has some bigger circles on this map. And all that basically says is that these are areas where maybe some of the hazards aren't as bad as they are in other parts of Cascadia today, but they're going to get pretty bad by the end of the century with high sea level rise. And so they might be places that we're not thinking about it enough now, but we should potentially be thinking about it. And then finally, this is the same metric that I've been talking about, the beach safety proxy, the beach collision or dune collision hours proxy, and the overtopping, but now for Cannon Beach itself. So kind of drilling down, just kind of produce this plot, I guess, a couple of months ago for the first time, and you can see the long-term variability. Hopefully, you guys are the ground truth about whether this makes sense, because these beaches a lot better than we do. But some of the areas that have kind of the more narrow beaches, kind of bluffs coming right down to the edge of the water, have the pinks now in this map, and then you can see some of the areas that are getting worse into the future. Okay, so these are the kinds of data that we've now produced everywhere in Cascadia, and have the ability to kind of drill down at relatively high resolution throughout the region. Okay, all right, so it's a lot of information. The idea is that shoreline change, flooding, backshore erosion, beach safety hazards are all going to increase throughout the 21st century. Obviously, the sea level rise rate is going to be one of the major factors in terms of dictating how bad things get with these things. Beach and backshore erosion was the hazard of all the ones I just showed. It was increasing the fastest throughout the region. And we think that by quantifying these hazards over a range of potential futures, future sea level rise, future El Nino climate, future potential wave climate, these are the things that can hopefully help Oregon's coastal communities prepare and ideally adapt to climate change. And I think this is a very similar figure to what Jessica showed in terms of the range of adaptation options that are available. You guys talked about it for the last couple of hours. It was mentioned by both Meg and Jessica that myself and my colleagues, Megan Wengrove, Sally Hacker, Dan Cox, Greg Wilson, a lot of folks at OSU are spending quite a bit of time thinking about these various different adaptation options. Megan in particular looking at the dynamic copper revetments, trying to work towards more engineering design guidance over a range of different conditions. We've been spending a lot of time over the years thinking about Oregon's coastal dunes and the the beach grasses that we had, how they trap sediment, et cetera. And so, a lot of knowledge, still being developed at OSU and trying to kind of work on this suite of adaptations, because a lot of the data that I just showed that these situations, the issues that we're already having and we've been talking about for the last couple of hours are certainly not going away in the next couple of days. So thanks very much for having me.
Questions from the audience? Thank you.
So if I'm tracking what you're saying, with sea level rise, we can add more beach trees, we losing the beaches. Does that impact the decision process then we're talking about hard structure that also relates to beach trees and loss of beaches? You know, is your group thinking about that interplay?
Certainly, I mean, we are working on models that try to evolve the kind of that natural couple human system, right? And you know, including Meg and others from the agencies in terms of those discussions, because it's certainly an interplay and feedbacks between, you know, more arm rains typically happens when you have El Niños and high wind wave water level seasons, but then that actually begets a loss of the beach, right? So I think it was, you know, mentioned a couple of times. I mean, ideally, we'd be able to protect both the backshore infrastructure and keep the wide sandy recreational beach. Sometimes that's a hard thing to do. A lot of trade-offs out there.
Would you mind going back to the Cannon Beach specific? Yes, and can you walk us, so I'm not sure when you say recreational, that people know what you mean.
Yeah.
So can you walk us through these terms? So safe collision, can you talk about each of those in a little more depth?
The row on the left is our safety metric. And it's basically how often that there's a beach during daylight hours in which the width of the beach is at least 10 meters. You think that's a pretty arbitrary number, but we spend a lot of time talking to a lot of different people about these numbers, and it's easy to modify that criteria in our model. So this is ultimately what Meredith chose to kind of run this full analysis. We spoke with a lot of folks in state parks, a lot of people just use beaches and a lot of the work we did in Tillamook County. And the idea was, you know, if you have at least 10 meters of beach during daylight hours, you can walk your dog along the beach, you can fly a kite, you can, you know, a day like today, going day in the state of Oregon, you can actually sit down and be warm, right? And so those are the kinds of things you can do with a 10-meter beach, right? But it was mentioned, I think Meg mentioned, there's lots of places, maybe not lots, but there's a handful of places in Oregon where areas have been riprap during a lot of tidal cycles. That beach is no longer usable. You cannot go in the alongshore because the water is banging against the riprap, right? So that is what we call an unsafe beach hour when that happens, and the model is meant to produce that.
And that's represented by collision?
No, that's the S, that's the safety. That's the
Okay,
one on the
all right.
far left, right? Collision is actually when the waves, the leading edge of waves are banging into the dune or bluff, actually causing erosion, right? So it's a little bit, you know, it's as bad as the safety metric, but it's a little bit more, a little bit worse situation.
Okay, so that's just addressing the erosion.
Yep.
And then overtopping.
Overtopping is when the water gets over the sand dune or whatever the barrier is. You know, a lot of the big, walk along the beach before I came here, you know, a lot of the dunes are relatively high, bluffs down to the south, right? So that's, overtopping is not really an issue for, unless maybe the beach access points, right? But there are plenty of other places, you know, a lot of the barrier spits in Oregon, where overtopping is a concern, so that's what we have with them.
And then in the earlier slide, you were addressing the squeeze, so
Right.
the narrowing of the beach with the same kind of breakdown of timeline or sea level rise. Can you quantify that in feet, like in low sea level rise, Cannon Beach can expect to lose X width of beach? Can you give us any sort of?
Yeah, well, expect meaning, this model has a lot of caveats,
Yeah.
a lot of assumptions. And so it's, yeah, we were able to do a reasonably decent job of time casting the historical time periods. We ran the model into the future, making a ton of assumptions, okay? But you're seeing, it's hard to tell with this image, but you know, this kind of orange color is about 50 to 70 meters of erosion. So multiply that about a little over 350 to 200 feet of continued erosion. That's what these models are producing in terms of, by the end of the century, so that's 75 years old. And it gets worse for the bigger sea levels. There's a lot of caverns.
What advice do you give communities? So how do you start to address this and do responsible planning and stewardship?
Well, I mean, I think the conversation we had for the 2 hours before I started talking is this. I think the best advice that I can give the community is just have these conversations. Talk to people like Jessica, talk to people like Meg. I mean, have to know what the framework is in terms of what's allowable, and have to have the experience. I mean, the amazing thing about Washington is because of the Sailor Sea, a lot of things are able to be tried that on the outer coast have not been tried. So there may be a little bit more experimentation would be great. I know that's not an easy sell for people that have their property, but we've convinced Oregon State Parks to do some experimentation on some of their property. And then they started to keep a look at it. And that was the first dynamic hubble revetment in the region, was at the Keep Lookout State Park, right? So they kind of got us going on this pathway, but you know, they haven't done a lot of kind of, you know, the wood placement. That could be a way to slow down some of these things, right? You know, we kind of was alluded to, but many beaches, many communities and countries, and you know, certainly throughout the United States, use beach nourishment as a way to slow things down. And a lot of communities are going to be perfectly fine for decades, if not centuries, because they're going to continue to put beach sand and keep their wide recreational beaches. And they've figured out mechanisms to tax not only the people who live there, but also the tourists to come in and do that. That's a much harder thing to do here for a variety of reasons. The wave climate, the lack of a weather window to do the construction, we don't have the infrastructure. I mean, there's lots of ships that are, you know, doing the dredging, and they also serve as barges, pump the sediment on shore that exists all throughout the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. We don't have that infrastructure. So it's going to cost a lot of money to do those kinds of things. But that is one thing that has worked in many places around the world. I mean, there's still reasons why it's not spectacular. I mean, there's negative ecological impacts, but at least it keeps a wide beach, and you can potentially maintain protection of the back shores.
Are there any communities that have created their own, you know, fund to try to do some of this experimentation or support homeowners that are looking for more sustainable solutions?
In Oregon, I don't know. I mean, I think Meg would have a much better sense, maybe some of the other nonprofits like Charlie Clyde and the Surf Rider pays attention to that. Certainly in other parts of the United States, I mean, it is, you know, the local economics have been figured out to do the beach nourishment. I mean, just we're talking about projects that cost tens of millions of dollars a year, and that's being financed by a lot of it is the tourists that are coming in and using those beaches. So there are some, you know, really good examples of that. And I mean, a lot of places in the East Coast where they haven't figured it out as well. So it is a community by community situation. I don't know of any good examples in the Northwest. But the best place for experimentation has been the Washington Beach. They just have the ability to dump a lot of different things, try these different solutions, and they've had reasonable success. It's been a very unique situation.
Other questions in the audience? Is there anybody on Zoom?
Yeah, we're still waiting. Wait, has his hand up.
I didn't hear them.
Play.
Oh, wait. Hi, Clay.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Again, thank you for being here. My name's Clay Newton. I serve on the Planning Commission. We are often have this conversation with something that's very easy for us to see. A homeowner has an eroded bank in front of them. It's very easy for us to look at, you know, an eroded bank and go, yeah, there's damage there. It's a harder concept to understand our beach eroding. Can you explain, I don't want to say in layman terms, because maybe it's just me that's not always getting this, but I think it would be helpful to understand what it means to have our beach eroding because of hard structures that have been approved in the past. When we look at our beach and it's just so wide, and you know, there's been riprap there for any number of years, and we're all still able to walk on the beach. maybe through examples of other communities or just a walkthrough for all of us in terms of what's happening that's causing our beach to erode if we approve hard structures?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think we do conflate a variety of different things that are happening. So a lot of times riprap goes in to protect the backshore infrastructure because there was very recently big storms or El Nino event. I mean, 97, 98, was kind of a really massive 82, 83 as well, in terms of when we really started tracking in Oregon, the fact that arming was proliferating because so many areas were getting hit hard. It's these big kind of climatic events. So the beaches erode because of high water levels and high waves. People respond to that. But then that sediment, Jessica mentioned the seasonal cycle of sand coming back. Sometimes it does take years. And I've been mentioning a couple of times this lower frequency modulation that's kind of years to decades. And it's really kind of eye-opening. We're actually, I think maybe you guys might know this story of Pacific City and Nestawin, where Pacific City in the late 70s, early 80s was being armored because the dunes were eroding. Nestawin was a big dune field. That seems crazy, right? Because we all know Nestawin has nothing but rock right now, and Pacific City was buried in sand. That was not the case in the late 70s, early 80s. I think that's the image that Paul Combar showed you just. That changed. We're seeing that actually all over the Pacific Northwest, and it's just these decadal cycles of sediment. So I think the thing is that areas got riprap because they needed it, or the homeowners decided that they needed it. Then the sediment came back, and for years to decades, that part of the coast was not eroding. I mean, you think about the northern Cannon Beach littoral cell. I showed you a bunch of data that shows that it's been relatively stable. It's in the south part of the cell that, at least over the last couple of decades, has had lower erosion rates. So I think it hasn't been tested in terms of being hit by waves, and so you might not have seen the edge effects that we've been talking about, those kinds of things. But the problem with sea level rise is it happens everywhere, right? That comes in, and the wave runoff is going to get further to the beach. It's going to start attacking the structures more. That's when you get the tow scour that Jessica was talking about. That's when you get the edge effects, is when you get more impact of the coastal processes with the structures. So that'll happen. But then you also just literally have the drowning of the beach because the water level is higher. You have a beach slope, the water level goes up, it has to lose beach because of it. That's not, you don't need sediment transport associated with that. You just need basically the flooding of that area. It turns out, we know from the coastal principles that you get a little bit more of a retreat than just that flooding. We have kind of this, back of the envelope, for every 1 meter or 1 foot of rise of sea level, about 100 feet of erosion will occur. That's a very kind of gross assumption, but a lot of that is kind of baked into the model results that I showed. So I think that's rambling, but hopefully that addresses the question about why you might not have seen a lot of negative impacts of the structures that have been placed for years to decades. But in the future, with sea level rise and changing patterns of storminess, you might get that situation.
All right. Go ahead.
Can you hear me okay still?
Yeah, go ahead, Clay.
You had a slide. First couple slides you had showed different rates of erosion on the beach. I actually tracked on that one better than some of the others. I think it was either your second or third slide you showed. It was not this one, more colored, I think. Maybe one more before it. Maybe one more before. Was there one before this? Yeah, this one. And I don't have an arrow to really point along here, but that red line along the shore there, that red very thin line, that's different rates of erosion along our beach. Is that right?
Yep.
And
yep, that's the 4 to 24.
Can you give me some various, I'm online here and I can't really see different points of reference in terms of where the greatest erosion is. It looks like it's toward the top of the red line is the greatest erosion up there as it really slopes hard to the right. Is that right? Am I interpreting this
Yeah, you guys know the geography better than I do, but this is the area that is kind of the fast rate of erosion right here, so. Somebody wants to point out a feature.
Okay. And this is, I don't know if this makes any sense at all or not, but you know, our beach is protected in different ways at different points. The northern point has little protection other than sand. There's a section along Acola Creek that has a seawall. And then we have quite a bit of armoring down toward the southern part of our beach. I guess I was just wondering if there's any correlation to erosion on our beach to the different types of protection those different sections of the shore have, if that had been looked at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a very interesting thing to look at. Just a reminder, this is the sandy beach. This is that kind of, think of it as like the wet dry interface, right? So there's always a beach here. And so this is not something that's up against the base of the dunes or the base of the bluffs or the structures, right? Just to clarify.
Okay.
The thing we're quantifying.
But it would be interesting to overlay the different types of shore protection structures with this graph and just see if there's any correlation to these erosion rates with those structures. Because one of the things about the structures too is it makes it harder for the beach to recover even seasonally with the structures because depending on what it is. If it's a cobble berm, right, you've seen that sand can accumulate. That's why they're sort of pro cobble berm. For direct rep revetment, it's harder for sediment to accumulate on a rep revetment. Usually it's a steeper slope. That's one of the reasons. So depending on what the shoreline treatment is, it can be easier or harder for a shoreline to sort of experience that natural recovery rate.
Okay, anybody else on Zoom?
Yeah, Will Parson.
Okay, go ahead, Will.
You weren't kidding when you said no.
Hey.
Just do it.
Thanks, Professor, for putting this information together. This is absolutely fascinating stuff. As somebody who deals with Oregon Coast projects all the time, shoreline protection projects occasionally, this is just very, very helpful data to have. Some of your conclusions are, I don't know, terrifying, I guess I'd say, if I'm understanding you right, with forecasting inland creep in the scale of dozens of meters. Now, I guess your time frame is over, 50, 75 more years. But am I hearing you right that you're just anticipating more dramatic inland creep and what do you call it, beach squeeze, just under all models, that we're going to see more of these hazards rise up just in all of your models moving forward?
Yeah, with the caveat being, I mean, all those lines that I showed had a longshore variability, so it was worse in some areas and maybe not so bad in other areas. So part of that is just dictated by areas that have had a lot of positive sediment supply and beach building in the last couple of decades. We have no other kind of solution to project that forward at this point. It was mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of additional sediment supply from rivers in many of the places that we're talking about. So, it's kind of what you have is what you get. There was a question earlier about kind of headland bypassing of sediments. There's probably not a heck of a lot of headland bypassing to the north or sediment coming down to the south. That's a pretty significant headland. A little less significant to the south, but you get a lot of cobble beaches down there, not a huge sand supply. So yeah, I think we're kind of stuck with what we have in terms of sand, and it's kind of the eroding bluffs and dunes there, like the only additional source other than what's coming maybe occasionally from offshore. So yeah, yes, right, there was some terrifying results from the models that have a lot of simplifications and assumptions built in.
Yeah. Another data point for you, just as you're telling these stories and giving this presentation, you talk about kind of surges for what in my mind are permits, but you just talk about people coming in trying to get hard protection, seawalls and whatnot around El Nino events and high erosion events. I'm sure that's true. But just from talking to the folks that run permits at OPRD, I know that over the last 10 years, the number of applications they're getting for those types of shoreline protective structures have gone up several fold, over 100, like 200% or 300% per year, comparing what they were getting, in the 2010s to the 2020s. So it might just be, I suspect somebody over there has the exact number for you, but it might be interesting for you to get that data just to roll into your thinking on this stuff. Thanks so much for putting this all together. It's fascinating information.
Okay, anybody else on Zoom? One last chance for the audience. Okay, thank you very, very much. It's a very educational evening.
Thank you. Are you tired?
We do have a little bit of. We have good order, and I think. There, Councilor the President, good order. Bruce, do you have something? Oh, you do, okay. One last check. Okay, thanks again for organizing this, and thank you for coming, and I was in charge of weather, so. Go ahead and enjoy.